Have you ever felt torn between the security of peaceful love and the mystery of intense passion? The day Rachel Stone got her internship at Outvoice Productions, she couldn't believe her luck. After months of sending resumes and receiving no's, one of the main audiobook producers in New York had bet on her, even without direct experience in the area. She was young, full of desire, and with a natural talent for communication. But she never imagined that this talent would take her into such a competitive world full of famous professionals. Outvoice was exactly as she had imagined, a modern building, glass walls, and a minimalist design that exuded professionalism and success. At the reception, Rachel could hardly hide her excitement. Your first day would be on the administrative side, helping to organize scripts and recording sessions. Although anxious, she felt like this was the chance she needed to finally find a place where she could grow. As soon as she entered the main floor, Rachel was greeted by warm staff who guided her through her first tasks. Her enthusiasm was evident, and every little detail impressed her. Until suddenly, she was interrupted by a scream coming from the hallway. A firm and authoritative voice questioned someone intensely, and Rachel immediately hid behind a partition, just to catch a glimpse of the scene. A tall man with carefully combed hair and a stern look was reprimanding one of the employees. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he exuded an aura of authority. It was Alexander Reed, the CEO of Outvoice, known for being as demanding as he was brilliant. He didn't seem like the type to tolerate mistakes, and Rachel, who until then thought she was confident, felt a slight shiver when she observed his posture. Immediately, she promised herself that she would do everything she could to remain unnoticed and avoid attracting attention. However, this proved to be impossible. An hour later, as Rachel was trying to organize recording folders in the main room, she tripped over a cable and in a split second found herself on the floor, papers scattered everywhere. To make matters worse, when he tried to get up, he accidentally dropped a stack of expensive headphones, which scattered across the wooden floor, echoing in the silence of the room. Before she could react, she felt a pair of eyes watching her. When she looked up, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his gaze impassive, as if he was calculating how many chances she would have of doing something like that again. A brief moment of uncomfortable silence fell as Rachel tried to process what she would say to apologize. Alexander, however, remained quiet, just observing her enigmatically. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something or let her sink further into her own shame. Rachel felt her face heat up, and all she could do was mutter an apology, trying her best to collect the scattered headphones and fallen papers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm, breaking the silence. Rachel nodded vigorously, unable to find the right words. She had heard stories about Alexander Reed, a demanding, perfectionist business genius who rarely showed sympathy. But there, in front of her, he didn't just look like the distant, cold CEO everyone feared. There was something in his gaze, something she couldn't decipher. Before he could come up with any adequate response, a new voice sounded in the background. "Hey, you must be the new intern." She turned and saw a smiling young man with disheveled hair and a relaxed posture approaching. It was Liam Hart, one of Outvoice's most popular narrators, known not only for his distinctive voice, but also for his friendliness. He had a gleam in his eyes that contrasted with Alexander's rigid expression. Liam extended his hand, helping her to get up, and began to collect the papers with her. "Don't worry, accidents happen. Just be careful not to do it in the recording room." He blinked, and Rachel felt a wave of relief. Alexander, on the other hand, remained distant, just observing their interaction. Liam's presence seemed to bring a slight relaxation to the environment, while Alexander continued with his air of silent judgment. Rachel felt the CEO's gaze like a weight on her back, but she tried to hide her tension. Later, after collecting everything and organizing the equipment, Rachel was called to a welcome meeting with the production team. She sat next to Liam, who seemed inclined to guide her through every detail and listen to her superior's instructions. She tried to focus on the information, but Alexander's presence in the room felt like a constant pressure. When he spoke, his voice was firm and cutting, making it clear that there was no room for error. After the meeting, Liam approached her and invited her for coffee during the break. His friendliness was genuine, and during the conversation he talked about the difficulties and joys of being an audiobook narrator. "We think it's just reading, but there's a lot of emotion involved. Every word has to be felt, you know. It's not as easy as it seems." Rachel listened to him attentively, enchanted. Liam had a natural talent for captivating people, and his presence was warm, almost as if he were an old friend in her life. Unlike Alexander, who seemed unattainable, Liam was easy to connect with, and she began to relax around him. However, upon returning to work, Rachel couldn't shake Alexander's stern gaze from her thoughts. He seemed to watch her every move, as if he was waiting for the next mistake. She wondered what she had done to attract his attention so negatively on the first day. While Liam made her laugh and forget her insecurity for a few moments, Alexander seemed tireless in reminding her that there was no room for amateurism there. At the end of the day, Rachel was already exhausted, but satisfied. Even with the setbacks, she felt like this was the right place for her. Before leaving, she was told that she had to review some scripts for the next day. Excitedly, she took the material and headed to the elevator. When the doors were about to close, a hand stopped them from closing, and Alexander entered. She froze, trying to maintain her composure. The silence was palpable, and she felt exposed under his gaze, which seemed to read every detail of her expressions. Finally, he spoke, surprising her. "You know, Rachel, I admire the determination of those who choose this career, but there's no room for carelessness here. I hope you learned from what happened today." His bluntness took her by surprise, and she hesitated before answering. Yes, sir. It won't happen again." Alexander studied her for a second before giving a slight nod, as if satisfied. But before leaving the elevator, he released one last sentence that made her reflect for a long time. "Remember that a voice can be both a blessing and a responsibility." Rachel watched the doors close, still intrigued by his comment. That sentence seemed to carry more meaning than she could understand at that moment, and as she walked home, she couldn't get the CEO's intense and distant figure out of her head, who seemed to be carrying the weight of secrets she didn't understand. Upon arriving home, Rachel sat at the table in her small kitchen, mentally reviewing every detail of the day. From the funny moments with Liam to the constant tension with Alexander, everything felt surreal. She felt a mixture of fear and excitement as she thought about what the next few days had in store. She knew she would have to work hard to live up to expectations, and more than ever, she was determined to do her best. When he finally laid his head on the pillow, late at night, he remembered Alexander's words once again, as if his deep voice still echoed in his mind. Amid her exhaustion, she promised herself that, regardless of the challenges, she would not allow the first day to define her trajectory at Altvoice. There was something bigger there, something that she still couldn't understand, but that already attracted her like an enigma waiting to be solved. On the second day, Rachel arrived at the Altvoice building even more determined. The image of Alexander watching her with that critical look was engraved in her mind, but now it was accompanied by another sensation, a renewed firmness. Despite her first day's setbacks, she knew she had potential and wasn't going to let insecurity get in the way. Upon entering the office, he took a deep breath and headed to the floor where audiobook recordings were made. A mix of admiration and nervousness coursed through her body as she walked down the hall. This time, Rachel was called to help with the recording of one of the most anticipated releases of the season, a detective novel written by a famous author. She heard rumors the day before that the person responsible for narrating this audiobook was none other than Liam Hart. The name was quite familiar to her. He was one of the most prestigious narrators in the industry, with a voice that captivated and transported listeners to another world. In fact, she had already heard some of his narrations, and it was impossible to deny the talent he possessed. Liam was known for his professionalism and friendliness, and Rachel was both excited and terrified at the idea of working directly with someone so renowned. When she arrived at the studio, she was greeted by a producer named Karen, a fast-talking, experienced woman who seemed to control the workflow with precision. Karen explained Rachel's tasks, which included organizing the script, reviewing some passages of text, and monitoring recording times. Rachel made an extra effort not to get distracted, writing down every detail to avoid any mistakes. She had slept poorly the night before, worried about making another faux pas in front of her colleagues. And now she reminded herself every moment to concentrate as much as possible. Shortly afterwards, the studio door opened, and Liam walked in with the confidence of someone who seemed to shine wherever he was. He was wearing a casual shirt and jeans, and his brown hair was slightly messy, as if he had walked straight out of a photo shoot. Seeing him enter, Rachel tried to look busy, but she felt her heart race. "Ah, so you're the new assistant," he said, smiling when he noticed Rachel standing next to the recording equipment. He approached her with an easy smile and curious eyes, but it didn't take him long to notice her nervousness. "Rachel, right? I'm Liam. Karen told me you're going to be at the session today." "Yes," Rachel replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll help with the script and the timer. I'm happy to be here, and of course help with whatever you need." Liam looked at her for a second and smiled, genuinely friendly. "Excellent. Anything, you can talk. I hope you're not one of those people who gets scared by a little improvisation, because this book, well, I have a tendency to add special touches to the characters." Rachel smiled back, a little more relaxed, but not knowing exactly what to expect from this special touch. He seemed too comfortable in the studio, and Rachel realized he treated the place like an extension of himself. Every microphone, every headphone, every adjustment felt perfectly natural to him. As soon as recording began, Rachel kept an eye on the script and the timer, checking each marking as instructed. Karen watched her closely, apparently pleased with Rachel's performance. Liam's reading was impeccable, each word coming out with precision and emotion, and she noticed how he adapted his tone of voice for each character, changing from one sentence to another with ease. But suddenly, something distracted her. She noticed that there was a small difference between the recording time in the script and what was recorded on the digital timer. Confused, Rachel decided to adjust the count, as she believed the error could compromise the final edit. Trying not to make noise, he quickly adjusted the equipment, without realizing that this was affecting the audio feedback that Liam heard. Immediately, he stopped talking and looked at Karen, who at first seemed confused, but soon realized that Rachel had changed the timer without warning. Liam took off his headphones, looking at her with an expression of slight surprise. "Is everything okay, Rachel?" he asked, in a tone that was not rude, but suggested that the error had not gone unnoticed. Rachel felt her face flush. "Oh, sorry. I thought there was a mistake in the marking, so I thought it was better to adjust." Karen furrowed her eyebrows. "Always let me know before making any changes, Rachel. This can disrupt the recording process and confuse the narrator." Rachel mumbled another apology, feeling herself sink into her chair. She knew she had been impulsive, and now the discomfort was taking over her. The first mistake of the previous day was no longer enough. Now it seemed that his presence was more of a distraction than a help. Liam, realizing how embarrassed she was, broke the tense atmosphere with a light laugh. "It's okay, Rachel. I think we've all done this at one time or another. I myself still get confused with some markings. Besides, it's just the beginning. I'm sure you'll get the hang of it." Liam's friendly gesture made her relax a little, and she smiled shyly. "Thank you. I will be more careful next time." She knew she needed to learn from those little mistakes, but every detail seemed to be piling up into a big pile of insecurities. Liam put his headphones back on, but before the recording resumed, he cast one last glance at Rachel, as if saying without words that there was no reason to worry so much. During the next few minutes, the recording went smoothly and efficiently, and Liam continued with the narrative, alternating tones of voice, laughter, and even small sighs for the characters he played. Rachel found herself smiling every now and then, admiring his skill. The ease with which he created a fictional environment, as if the characters were really there, was fascinating. For the first time since entering that studio, Rachel felt inspired and involved in her work. The session concluded about an hour later, and Karen quickly praised Liam for his performance, while Rachel hurried to gather materials for review. The recording was so impressive that, for a moment, she even forgot about the stopwatch incident. As she organized the files and checked the equipment, she felt a presence beside her. It was Liam again, who approached silently, watching her with an amused smile. "Look, Rachel, I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable before. Sessions don't always go as we expect, but that's part of the job. And I understand that it's a lot to absorb in the first few days. Don't cover yourself so much." Rachel felt a wave of relief and gratitude for his gesture of understanding. It was easy to imagine why Liam was so popular, not just for his voice, but for his warm, welcoming demeanor. She looked at him, and for a moment, she forgot about hierarchy and roles, feeling like she was just a person who admired another. "Thanks, Liam. I guess I really want to make it here, you know? I've been waiting so long for a chance like this, and now I feel like I'm making mistakes in such small ways." "Hey," he said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're doing well. Seriously, everyone makes mistakes. I've even forgotten entire lines, reversed chapter orders, and even said things that weren't in the text. Just don't tell anyone else." He winked, and Rachel laughed. In that moment, Rachel realized there was something reassuring about Liam, a sense that it was okay to be human, to be flawed. With a smile, she thanked him again, and the two left the studio together, exchanging ideas about the book he had just recorded. Rachel was surprised to see that he really enjoyed sharing details of his art, how he imagined the characters, and how he tried to bring each of them to life. As they walked down the corridor, they encountered Alexander, who was observing the scene with an impassive expression, but carrying an attentive gaze. He greeted Liam with a brief wave and took a longer look at Rachel, as if assessing the impact of that interaction with the narrator. "Rachel," he called her. "One word, please." She exchanged one last look with Liam, who seemed to sense the tension in the air and gave her an encouraging smile. Then, Rachel followed Alexander to his room, trying to maintain her composure. As soon as the door closed, Alexander got straight to the point. "I heard there was an adjustment error in the recording." Rachel felt her mouth dry. "It was a misunderstanding, sir. I thought there was a problem with the recording time and tried to fix it. I didn't want to cause any inconvenience." He watched her in silence for a moment, his dark, piercing eyes analyzing every detail of her expression. Then he spoke in a calm but firm tone. "Being here requires more than enthusiasm, Rachel. You need to have discernment. When adjusting anything, don't do it alone. We work as a team for a reason." Rachel nodded, taking in every word. She realized that Alexander wasn't simply making the criticism. He was trying to prepare her in a harsh way, but with a clear purpose. "Yes, sir. Thanks for the advice," she replied, head bowed. When she looked up, he was already turning towards the table, ending the conversation. Rachel left the room feeling smaller, but also more focused. When he arrived at his table, he noticed that Liam had left a note with a drawing of a small smiling sun, on which he had written, "Everything will be fine." She laughed, putting the note in her pocket and promising herself that despite her mistakes, she would keep trying. On the third day, the anxiety no longer seemed to weigh so much on Rachel. After her conversations with Liam, and in some ways, even after her brief confrontation with Alexander, she felt a little safer, like she was beginning to understand how Altvoice works and her place there. When he arrived at the office early, he noticed that the studios were silent, with only a few lights on. Maybe he could take the opportunity to review notes and avoid any mistakes that would interfere with Liam's work. He had barely settled in when he received an unexpected call. It was to go directly to Alexander Reed's office, which made his heart beat faster. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but something about the formal tone of the request made her think it wasn't simply small talk. When he reached the glass door with his name on it, he hesitated for a second before knocking. "Come in," said the deep voice on the other side. She opened the door, and Alexander looked up from his computer, beckoning her closer. He watched her with a neutral expression, but Rachel noticed a slight change in his posture. Maybe it was just an impression, but he seemed somehow intrigued. "Rachel," he began, directly and bluntly, "I know you're still adjusting, but I'd like to entrust you with a slightly more complex task. I know you have already started supporting Liam, but from today onwards you will have a more active role during the recordings. I need you to review the scripts and make adjustments to the text in case any errors go unnoticed by the editor." Rachel blinked in surprise. Working directly on reviewing the scripts and adjusting the narrative in real time was a huge responsibility, and she could hardly believe he would trust something like that to a newcomer. "Of course, sir," she replied, trying not to show her excitement. "I thank you for the opportunity. I will do my best." Alexander nodded, keeping his gaze steady on her. "Just a warning, Liam is a perfectionist. He likes each word to have a specific rhythm, an exact intonation, so prepare for adjustments and questions. He demands this of himself and therefore ends up demanding the same of those who work with him." Rachel felt a shiver of apprehension upon hearing Alexander's words. She knew Liam was a demanding professional, but being on the front line, responsible for reviewing the text and ensuring the accuracy of the recordings, made her even more nervous. There was no room for failure, especially now that Alexander seemed to be watching her every move with interest. "I understand, sir," she said, trying to sound assured. "I will study the script carefully before each recording." He nodded again, and before walking away, said with a firmness that she was already beginning to recognize, "I'm giving you this chance because I see how dedicated you are, but also because this is an important project for Altvoice. I hope you are up to the challenge." Rachel thanked her and left the room with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. Alexander was firm in his words and maintained that imperturbable expression, but Rachel felt something different in his gaze. Maybe it was just an impression, but it seemed like he saw her as a promising prospect, someone who could really contribute. She returned to the studio carrying the weight of her new responsibility, determined to prove herself. Upon entering, he found Liam adjusting the equipment, rehearsing some lines with his voice low, as if he was already absorbed by the character. As soon as he saw her, he smiled and gestured for her to come closer. "Looks like I have a new recording partner now," he said enthusiastically, without losing the sparkle in his eyes. "Alexander told me that you will be responsible for reviewing the texts." "That is great. Sometimes I get tangled up in the lines myself." Rachel returned the smile, but internally she felt the weight of responsibility. She knew that any mistake could compromise not only Liam's work, but also her reputation. So he held the script so tightly that his hands began to feel clammy. Liam, attentive as always, noticed her nervousness and reassured her with a touch on the shoulder. "Hey, relax. I trust you will do a great job. I know it's a little intimidating, but you'll get used to it. In the end, it's like telling a story together, you know?" She nodded, taking Liam's words as encouragement. His manner, always friendly and full of enthusiasm, was exactly what she needed to stay focused. At that moment, she promised herself that she would do everything to honor the trust that Alexander and Liam had placed in her. The first recording with Rachel in the role of reviewing the script began shortly after. Rachel positioned herself next to Liam, with the script in hand, paying attention to each sentence. The book's narrative required a precise rhythm, an intensity that should capture the listener. As the recording began, Rachel found herself mesmerized by Liam's voice, which glided through each line with precision and emotion. He seemed to really transform into the characters. As Liam progressed, Rachel noticed little details that could be improved. Words that sounded better in a slightly different order, or expressions that brought more clarity. She noted each adjustment carefully, ready to suggest them as soon as he stopped. When they reached the end of a chapter, Rachel hesitantly raised her hand. "Liam, could we change the order of some words in this sentence? I think I could make the impact of the speech stronger." Liam, who was pouring himself a drink of water, stopped and looked at her with a curious look. "Let me hear your idea," he said, with a faint smile that looked more like challenge than approval. Rachel adjusted the papers and read the sentence the way she had imagined. He paused after finishing, watching him carefully, looking for a reaction. Liam listened carefully and, to her surprise, nodded slowly. "You are right. This sounds more straightforward." "Great insight, Rachel," he said, with a tone that reassured her. The words of encouragement gave him new confidence. Working with Liam was challenging, but he listened to her openly, allowing her to explore her own abilities. Every adjustment and suggestion they made together seemed to bring the text to life in a way she had never imagined possible. As recording continued, Rachel began to realize how essential her own role was in the process. She found herself increasingly involved, correcting nuances in Liam's tone of voice, suggesting pauses to add more drama, and even pointing out where he could adjust his breathing to give more rhythm to his lines. Liam, in turn, accepted each of the suggestions, sometimes adapting them to his style, but never disregarding what Rachel brought. At the end of a long session, Liam looked at her with a look she recognized as genuine approval. "I think I found my new official recording partner," he said, with a wink. Rachel felt her face heat up, not knowing exactly how to respond. It was at that moment that Karen, the producer, entered the room. She paused for a second, watching the two, and then reported that Alexander was in the control area listening to the recordings. Rachel was momentarily nervous. Knowing that Alexander was evaluating her performance made her a little uncomfortable, but at the same time determined to show that she was up to the task. When they left the studio and went to the control room, Alexander watched them with an analytical expression. He waved them closer, and Rachel felt the weight of his gaze with every step. At the end of a brief silence, he looked directly at her. "I listened to the last few sessions," he said bluntly. "I have to admit that the adjustments you suggested to the text brought more clarity and fluidity to the narrative. That's the kind of attention to detail I need on this team." Rachel was surprised and at the same time relieved by the comment. Alexander was someone whose praise was scarce, and receiving a nod of approval from him, no matter how small, meant a lot to her. He, however, continued to observe her, as if the analysis had not yet ended. Liam approached Rachel, placing his hand on her shoulder in a casual gesture of support. "I told you she was good," he said, with the same confident smile as always. Alexander glanced quickly at Liam's hand on Rachel's shoulder, but quickly looked away and spoke to her again. "Keep it up. The quality of your work defines the quality of the entire production," he concluded, in a firm tone, but one that had a hint of encouragement. When Alexander walked away, Rachel felt like a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Liam was still at her side, and his smile widened. "You are doing a great job. Believe me, few newbies can please Alexander like that right off the bat." Rachel felt heat wash over her face. It wasn't just the praise, it was the fact that, little by little, she felt that she really was part of that world. Working with Liam was like discovering a hidden talent, and the way he encouraged her made all the difference. Even Alexander, in all his coldness and seriousness, seemed to begin to see something in her that she herself did not yet fully see. She left the studio that night with new confidence. Alexander's words and Liam's support echoed in his mind. Rachel was willing to face any challenge, learn and grow at Outvoice. After all, for her, every adjustment to the script, every improved sentence, and every moment alongside Liam and Alexander was a step towards something bigger. The next morning, Rachel arrived more confident, already feeling that her work with Liam was beginning to bear fruit. The previous sessions had gone well, and she felt increasingly integrated into the team. The responsibility of reviewing the script and suggesting adjustments was challenging, but Alexander's positive feedback and Liam's constant collaboration kept his motivation at an all-time high. When she arrived at the studio, she was informed by Karen that she would have to review the content of one of the final chapters before recording, as some changes had been made by the author and would need to be incorporated into the text. Rachel wasn't intimidated. She took the updated files and started analyzing them. The growing familiarity with the process made her increasingly comfortable, and she began to make the markings intuitively, thinking about the rhythm of Liam's speech and the nuances of the characters. After about an hour of work, Rachel adjusted the necessary parts and prepared to start recording with Liam, who arrived at the studio smiling and full of energy, as always. He was in a great mood and made jokes while getting ready, which made Rachel even more at ease. The session began, and the two quickly got into the rhythm. Rachel checked every mark in the script while Liam glided through the narrative with his engaging voice, bringing each dialogue and emotion to life. However, while tracking Liam's performance and monitoring the time, Rachel noticed that a small adjustment she had made to the order of the audio files seemed to be out of place. Suspicious, she paused the recording and reviewed the folders. He felt a sudden tension when he noticed that the finished file for one of the chapters was not in the right order. With a mix of anxiety and rush to avoid disrupting the workflow, he decided to move the file, adjusting it quickly. When making the change, he noticed that the computer froze for a second, without realizing the seriousness of what was happening. She tried to restart the system, but was surprised by an error message on the screen. He tried some basic commands, and before he could predict it, the system crashed, and the file he had just moved disappeared from the screen. Rachel felt her stomach drop in a mixture of panic and disbelief. He tried to restore the file in every way he knew, but nothing seemed to work. With each new failed attempt, the awareness of what had just happened became heavier. She had accidentally deleted one of the finished files, an entire chapter that was already ready for final editing. Liam noticed her desperate expression and stopped recording, looking at her with a look that mixed confusion and irritation. "Rachel, what happened? Why did you suddenly stop the session?" She hesitated. The words seemed to catch in her throat. His voice was low and shaky, almost a whisper. I think I deleted the finished chapter. I was trying to adjust the order of the files, and somehow the file disappeared." Liam's expression hardened immediately. His eyes narrowed as he took in what she had just said. "Did you delete the entire chapter?" "Rachel, this will delay the whole process. This chapter was ready, and now we're going to have to re-record everything from scratch." Rachel tried to explain, but her words came out jumbled. She felt herself shrinking under Liam's disappointed look, which had now completely lost its friendly, relaxed tone. "I know it was a mistake. I was just trying to adjust the sequence. I didn't realize. I'm so sorry, Liam." In truth, Liam shook his head, and his tone was harsher than Rachel had ever heard. "I am really sorry. Rachel, it took me days to finish that chapter. We are on tight deadlines, and this was the last thing we needed right now." She felt her face burn and looked away, unable to support the weight of disappointment written on Liam's face. The feeling of failure consumed her. I knew he was right. Not only had she lost a crucial file, but she had wasted hours of work from the entire team. Karen, who was outside, entered the studio after noticing the tense tone of the conversation. As soon as he found out what had happened, he gave Rachel a serious look. "Rachel, you know there are protocols for any changes to files. If you had informed us, we would have backed up and avoided this." Rachel felt the tears build up, but she held herself back, knowing that crying there would only make things worse. "I know, I'm really sorry. I just wanted to help organize, and, well, I should have followed the protocols." Karen just shook her head, sighing deeply. "We will have to report this to Alexander." Those words resonated like a sentence for Rachel. She could barely breathe as she imagined Alexander's reaction upon learning that one of the finished recordings had been deleted. He felt like he was about to fall apart, but he remained silent, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions. After a few minutes of awkward silence, Karen left the studio to report the problem. Liam was still at his side, but he remained silent, his expression still filled with frustration. Rachel dared not speak. He knew that any attempt to justify his mistake would sound weak given the gravity of what he had done. Shortly afterwards, Alexander entered the studio. Her gaze already reflected a mixture of disappointment and coldness, as if his mere presence drained all hope that the situation could be alleviated. "Rachel," he said in a calm but authoritative tone, "I would like to hear directly from you what happened." She took a deep breath, trying to gather the courage to face him. "I was adjusting the order of the files, and I ended up deleting the finished chapter. It was a mistake. I should have asked for help, followed protocol, but..." He raised his hand, stopping her. "I understand. We're talking about a finished file that will need to be written entirely, right?" Rachel nodded, unable to utter another word. The silence that followed seemed to suffocate her, each second stretching out like an eternity. Alexander looked at her with that impassive look, but she could feel the disappointment behind his restrained expression. "Rachel, I entrusted you with significant responsibility because I saw potential. This error, however, compromised an important part of the project," he said, his tone dry and firm, without any trace of compassion. "I know that you are new and that the process requires adaptations, but this failure will impact the entire team." The feeling of humiliation was overwhelming. Rachel knew her words wouldn't reverse the situation, but she still forced herself to speak. "Sir, I am willing to do whatever is necessary to make this right. I can stay late, help re-record, whatever is needed." Alexander kept his gaze steady on her, as if measuring the weight of her sincerity. After a moment of silence, he finally nodded, although his expression was still stern. "Very good. You'll have a chance to fix this. We'll re-record the chapter with Liam and ensure every adjustment is made exactly. Double work will be the price to pay for carelessness." Those words echoed in his mind as a reminder that there was no room for any more mistakes. She nodded, aware that this was her only chance to make up for the failure. As soon as Alexander left, Rachel looked at Liam, who still seemed dejected by the situation, but now maintained a more resigned air. He let out a long sigh, as if finally deciding to leave his irritation behind and get back to work. "Come on, Rachel. Let's start from scratch and finish this in one go. Just be careful this time," he said, with a tone that no longer sounded so distant, but still with a firmness that made it clear how much he valued this work. The afternoon passed at an exhausting pace, with Rachel and Liam re-recording every line, reviewing every nuance. Liam remained professional, but she could tell he was still unhappy. Rachel concentrated, trying not to let herself get discouraged, focused on regaining the confidence she seemed to have lost in that mistake. When they finally reached the end of the recording, Rachel felt emotionally drained. The atmosphere was still full of tension, but Liam, before leaving, turned to her and said in a less rigid, almost understanding tone, "It happens, Rachel. Just be more careful next time. We don't always have the chance to correct a mistake like that." She nodded, grateful for his attempt at understanding. "I knew it was rare to get a second chance after such a failure, and I felt I couldn't waste it." After Liam left, Rachel sat alone in the studio for a few minutes, processing everything that had happened. When she finally decided to get up, she found Karen in the hallway, who was watching her with a lighter, perhaps even sympathetic, expression. "Don't let it get you down too much, Rachel. We've all made mistakes. The important thing is to learn from this and move on." Rachel thanked her with a discreet smile and went home exhausted, but determined. That night, he reflected on his journey there and realized that mistakes didn't matter. She had to prove to herself, more than to others, that she was capable of evolving. With this renewed determination, Rachel closed her eyes and fell asleep, ready to start again the next day. In the days following the studio incident, Rachel devoted herself to every detail of her work with obsessive precision. "I wanted to eliminate any trace of insecurity and regain Alexander and Liam's trust." Although the atmosphere between her and Liam was less tense, there was a touch of formality that he now maintained, a silent reminder that the mistake was still fresh in both of their minds. With Alexander, the challenge seemed even greater. He observed his work from afar, showing no signs of approval or criticism. Rachel couldn't grasp what he really thought about her performance since the incident. One afternoon, after a particularly intense recording session, Rachel was finalizing some adjustments to the files when she was surprised by a message from Karen asking her to take some documents to Alexander's office. She felt a natural anxiety at the thought of having to face him again, still feeling the weight of the disappointment he had shown earlier. "However, I knew I couldn't avoid that interaction forever." He gathered the papers and took a deep breath before heading to his room. When she arrived, the door was ajar, and she heard voices coming from inside. He hesitated for a moment, but when he realized that Alexander was talking to someone else, he decided to wait. From the tone of the conversation, it seemed more personal than professional, and she didn't want to interrupt. However, the words she heard began to intrigue her. "I understand, Mom, but this really isn't a good time to discuss this again," Alexander said, his voice sounding tired, very different from his usual authoritative tone. He paused, and Rachel deduced that she was hearing the answer on the other end. "Yes, I know I promised to be there, but the situation here is complicated. You know how it is. Every mistake can compromise everyone's work." A sigh escaped him, and Rachel noticed a vulnerability she had never imagined in someone so rigid. "Look, I know you want me to visit Dad, but I'm really trying to dedicate myself to this project. I know it sounds like an excuse, but it's important to me. You know how hard I worked to get here." Rachel felt a wave of empathy when she heard Alexander's tone, so human and close. A tone of voice he had never used with her or any other colleague. She was surprised to realize that he also faced family pressures and ill Rochelle's. It was strange to imagine Alexander, the demanding and unwavering CEO, as a son trying to balance his professional obligations and family life. At that moment, Alexander noticed his presence and quickly ended the call. He remained silent for a few seconds, clearly disconcerted to see her there, but soon recovered his expression, assuming his distant and firm posture again. "Rachel, anything?" he asked, although his tone was less cold than usual. Rachel hesitated, but held up the documents she had come to deliver. "Karen asked me to take these papers, sir. I'm sorry I interrupted your conversation." Alexander nodded, avoiding looking into her eyes, as if he was reluctant to let any trace of the previous moment show. He took the documents and began to analyze them, but Rachel couldn't help but feel that something in that interaction had changed. Alexander seemed a little closer, in an almost imperceptible way, but it made her see another side of him. He looked at her again, with his usual searching gaze, but now without that touch of indifference. Rachel, in an impulse that even she didn't quite understand, felt the need to say something that would show that she respected him in a deeper way. "Sir, I just wanted to say that I know this position is very demanding, and I imagine it won't be easy. Altvoice is a big responsibility." Alexander watched her, perhaps intrigued by her courage in addressing something so personal. For a second, his face seemed to relax. He nodded, almost as if he was grateful for the comment, but then looked away, returning to focus on the papers. "Yes, but it is a necessary effort," he replied, evasively, but not exactly cold. Rachel felt he wasn't willing to share more than that, so she said goodbye quickly, feeling a strange mix of admiration and empathy. The vision of that brief moment of vulnerability continued to resonate in his mind. Alexander seemed to be someone who carried a heavy burden, and she now saw him with different eyes. The demand and perfectionism he imposed were not, as she had initially thought, traits of arrogance, but of someone who fought to keep his own structure intact amid pressures that few could understand. Over the next few days, Rachel felt that, even though nothing had been said explicitly, there was a subtle change in Alexander's treatment of her. In routine meetings and reviews, he looked at her less coldly and occasionally asked direct questions about her work, as if testing her understanding of projects or checking her attention to detail. Rachel, in turn, now saw his every comment in a different way, no longer with the fear she had before, but with a kind of renewed respect. She knew that, behind that impenetrable facade, there was a person who, like her, carried insecurities and pressures that no one imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing scripts for a new project in the empty studio, he heard footsteps approaching and, looking up, saw Alexander entering the room. He rarely showed up during recording times, and Rachel was surprised to see him there. "Rachel," he said, his voice softer than usual, "can I steal a few minutes of your time?" She nodded, intrigued, and he approached, taking a script from the table and analyzing some notes she had made. "I see that you are putting a lot of effort into the revisions. You have a good eye for text," he said, without his usual impassivity. Those words made Rachel's heart race. I didn't expect a compliment, much less from Alexander, someone who rarely showed approval openly. Before she could respond, he continued, "I value dedication, Rachel. I know there was a mistake recently, but I noticed you are trying hard to learn and correct it. It's something I appreciate, especially in a field where everyone expects perfection from the start." Rachel sensed the sincerity in his words, and an impulse to share something more personal struck her. She wanted to better understand what made Alexander behave so demandingly. And then, without knowing exactly why, he asked, "Did you always know you wanted to lead a production company? It seems like you carry a lot of responsibility alone." Alexander stared at her, surprised by the directness of the question. But instead of closing himself off, he seemed to reflect, as if trying to organize his thoughts. "It wasn't exactly a direct path. I grew up with a lot of expectations for myself, and over the years, I learned to deal with it. But, well, let's just say that the responsibilities I have today have made me who I am." There was a weight in those words, a mix of pride and sacrifice, that made it clear that Alexander was someone who had faced battles to reach that position. He looked at her, and Rachel noticed an intensity in his gaze that made her catch her breath. "Sometimes, Rachel," he continued in an introspective tone, "having power means having to give up certain personal aspects. There are days when this weighs more than others." He paused, as if carefully choosing his next words. "But it's all worth it when the job is done right." She felt a lump in her throat when she heard that. Alexander was someone who had sacrificed far more than he let on, and that inspired her in ways she couldn't explain. I understood now that he wasn't just the stern boss. He was someone who tried hard to maintain a firm facade, so that everything around him remained in order. "Thank you for sharing this, sir. I think it somehow helps me understand what I'm looking for too," Rachel said, with a sincerity she didn't expect to show. Alexander nodded, his gaze softer than usual, as if he truly considered her words. After a brief silence, he took a few steps back, giving a slight nod before leaving the studio, leaving her alone with a sense of deep admiration and respect. After that day, Rachel found herself feeling more inspired and focused than ever. The human side of Alexander that she had glimpsed made her want to dedicate herself to the fullest, not only for the work, but to honor the trust that he, in some way, had shown. She was determined to prove to him and to herself that she was capable of achieving something great. Over time, Rachel began to notice a slight change in the way Liam treated her. After the incident with the lost file, he kept a certain distance, and the conversations that had previously flowed naturally now seemed restrained, too professional. However, little by little, this barrier seemed to be breaking down. In the days that followed, he began to notice her continued effort to improve, and somehow, the severity in her gaze gave way to a touch of understanding. One morning, after a long meeting, Rachel was organizing her notes in the hallway when she heard hurried footsteps approaching. Before she could turn around, Liam walked past her and lightly touched her shoulder, making her jump. He had a somewhat provocative smile, something Rachel had noticed about him from the beginning, but hadn't seen in a while. "So how is the Redeemer of the Lost Files going?" he joked, with a tone that seemed closer than ever to his old style, relaxed and full of good humor. Rachel laughed, although she remembered how much she had suffered after the mistake. "I'm trying, right? Redemption is a slow process," she replied, with an unassuming smile. "But I'm glad Mr. Perfect Narrator noticed." He laughed heartily and, realizing that she was relaxed, decided to tease her a little more. "You know, being perfect is a huge responsibility. I need an impeccable team to maintain that reputation." Liam blinked and chuckled while Rachel shook her head. Although they began to get closer again, they both remained wary of each other. Even so, Liam's easy humor slowly rubbed off on Rachel again. And when he called her to talk or explain the details of the texts, she noticed that he observed her more attentively, as if he wanted to find traits that he had previously ignored. This new look of hers, attentive and careful, did not go unnoticed by him. Once again, Liam treated her like a colleague again, and over time, he seemed to forget the mistake that had previously driven them apart. In one of the recording sessions, Rachel, now more confident, followed the rhythm of the lines and marked the exact pauses while Liam read in his engaging voice. It was one of those intense moments where the central character of the story was on the verge of an important revelation, and Rachel was so focused that she didn't notice the time passing. When the scene ended, Liam put down the script and looked at her, clearly impressed with her commitment to the role. "You're pretty focused today, huh? He doesn't even look like the same person he did a few months ago," he commented, with a mixed expression of admiration and playfulness. Rachel, who was already starting to get used to his ability to improvise, decided to return the comment. "Well, when you work alongside a star narrator, you have to keep it level," she replied, giving the script a slight bow. He laughed, shaking his head. "Ah, you're already getting the hang of my game, aren't you?" he said, with an almost affectionate smile, which made her blush slightly. It was evident that, despite the jokes, there was something new and subtle in the way he looked at her. That same day, after recording, the two went out for coffee, something he suggested spontaneously and which surprised her. Sitting in a cozy cafe near the office, they started talking about their lives, their ambitions, and the reasons that led them there. Liam talked about the beginning of his career, the desire to bring characters to life, and how the voice, when used skillfully, had the power to convey much more than words could express. Rachel listened to him fascinated, absorbing every detail. Every now and then, he would pause to give her a provocative smile, knowing that she was so immersed in the conversation that she didn't notice the delighted expressions that were watching him. During the hours they spent together, Rachel realized there was a depth to Liam that she hadn't been able to see before. Behind the light and charismatic manner, there was someone dedicated to his work, with dreams and ambitions that went beyond fame or recognition. At one point, as they laughed at a funny story he told about his first recording, their eyes met and remained locked for longer than necessary. Rachel felt her face heat up, but she didn't look away. Something in that moment seemed to electrify the environment, as if a silent tension hovered between the two. Liam, with a low voice and a smile on the corner of his lips, joked, trying to disguise the intensity of that moment. "You know, Rachel, I think I'm discovering a very interesting side to you. A girl who almost made me lose my temper and now has become one of the best colleagues I could have." She laughed, although she felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Their approach seemed to flow naturally, but there was something that made them hesitate, a fear of crossing an invisible line that could change everything. In the days that followed, their work time became increasingly closer and lighter, as if any barrier had been definitively broken. Liam continued to make jokes during the recordings, teasing Rachel with the nickname Redeemed Perfectionist, and she returned each comment with a joke, creating a rapport that only increased. One night, after a long review session, they were both in the empty office, finishing the last notes. As they prepared to leave, Liam suggested they go for a walk before heading home, and Rachel, not sure why, immediately agreed. They went out together through the streets of New York, walking side by side under the light of the streetlights and the windows of closed stores. As they walked, Liam asked about Rachel's life, what she hoped for in the future, and whether she had ever imagined pursuing a career as a narrator. Rachel, caught off guard by the question, laughed and shook her head. "I narrator? I don't think my voice has the slightest talent for that," she joked, but he insisted, giving her an interested look. "I disagree. Voice is a question of authenticity, of intention. It's not about being perfect, but about conveying emotion, and I think you have it." Rachel felt a chill when she heard his words. She didn't know if it was the tone of his voice or the way he looked at her as he spoke, but something in those words touched her deeply. It was as if he saw something in her that not even she could see herself. She tried to hide the discomfort that the intensity of that gaze caused and diverted the topic, talking about how she really appreciated her supporting role and how much she was learning from everyone, including him. But as she spoke, she noticed that he was watching her carefully, as if trying to capture every detail of her expression. When they finally reached a quiet square, Liam sat down on one of the benches and invited her to join him. The silence of the city contrasted with the intensity of the emotions Rachel felt. The two were silent for a moment, until he, his voice softer than ever, commented, "You know, Rachel, you have a way that really makes a difference at work. I don't think I ever said this, but I learned a lot from your dedication." She smiled, surprised and grateful for the compliment, but didn't know how to respond. The way he spoke seemed to envelop her in a feeling of comfort and closeness. Every word that came out of him sounded authentic and warm, creating a connection she had never imagined possible with someone who, just a few months ago, treated her coldly. "Liam, you don't know how much it means to me to hear that. I always thought I was getting in the way at first, but you helped me a lot to grow here. I don't know if I would be the same without your guidance," she replied, trying to hide the emotion rising in her voice. Liam smiled and without hesitation took her hand, leaving a light, warm touch that sparked a current of electricity through Rachel's body. She felt her heart speed up and the world around her seem more distant. Neither of them said anything, but the gesture spoke more than words. He didn't let go of her hand, and they both stayed there, side by side, feeling the intensity of the moment without needing any explanation. Finally, Liam slowly let go of her hand, and the two continued to walk, exchanging looks and smiles that said more than any conversation could. Rachel, although reluctant to admit it, felt increasingly involved by him, by his presence, his provocative manner, and above all, by the way he made her feel valued. In the following days, the atmosphere between the two continued to strengthen, with jokes that left their co-workers intrigued. Karen even made a casual remark, implying that they seemed too close. Rachel tried to hide it, but she knew there was something more brewing between her and Liam, something they both seemed to avoid, but was clearly there. Each recording session was now accompanied by laughter, complicit glances, and moments of silence that, at times, spoke louder than any words. Rachel felt more and more connected to him, and although she knew she needed to stay focused on work, the growing attraction between them was undeniable. A week after the walk with Liam, Rachel's routine seemed to have taken on a new dimension. Although her interactions with Liam were increasingly close and filled with subtle meanings, she kept her focus on her work and tried to keep her feelings under control. But an unexpected turn of events was about to test her even further. One afternoon, as she was finalizing revisions on a script, Karen called her in for a quick chat in the meeting room. When he got there, he found not only Karen, but also Alexander, sitting at the head of the table with a contemplative expression. He gestured for her to sit, and Rachel noticed a subtle gleam of interest in his eyes, something that heightened her curiosity even further. "Rachel," began Alexander in his matter-of-fact tone, "Outvoice has been invited to participate in a special audiobook event next week. It's a marquee event, and our team will be hosting some live readings from upcoming projects." He paused as if to observe her reaction before continuing. "We'd like you to be one of the presenters." Rachel blinked in surprise and took a few seconds to absorb the proposal. "Me? But sir, I've never given an introduction like that." Alexander kept his gaze steady, as if there was no doubt in his choice. "That's exactly why we want you to do this. You know the texts like no one else. You understand the narrative, and you're more familiar with the characters than many first-time narrators. Plus, a new voice can bring something interesting to the presentation." Karen nodded, giving an encouraging smile. "You've done really well on the last few projects, Rachel. We know you can do this. Plus, Liam will help you prepare." Rachel felt overwhelmed by a mix of fear and excitement. On the one hand, the idea of representing the company and doing a live reading was daunting. On the other, it was a unique opportunity, and Alexander and Karen's confidence increased their determination to accept the challenge. The next day, she met with Liam to discuss the details of the reading. He seemed excited about the chance to help her, and the two spent the day analyzing the text, discussing the best intonation, pauses, and where it could create the most impact. For Liam, every word had a purpose, and he conveyed that passion to Rachel at every rehearsal session. The hours of preparation were filled with light conversation and occasional laughter, but their concentration on their work was visible. "Rachel, remember one thing," he said at one of the rehearsals, in a more serious tone than usual. "Don't worry about doing everything perfectly. The important thing is to convey emotion. Let the words resonate. Trust your interpretation." Rachel nodded, recording every detail of her advice, but a doubt continued to eat away at her confidence. What if she failed the presentation? What if your voice didn't convey the expected impact? Every insecure thought seemed to undermine hours of practice, and despite Liam's support, the anxiety persisted. On the day of the event, Rachel arrived at the venue early with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The atmosphere was elegant, with an audience that included authors, editors, and renowned figures from the entertainment industry. She tried to remain calm, but she felt that each step towards the stage increased her tension. When she finally positioned herself behind the scenes, she was overcome by a sudden crisis of insecurity. She was about to be the center of attention, something she had never imagined for herself, and Liam's words of encouragement, although comforting, seemed insufficient to calm the whirlwind of emotions she felt. Then, unexpectedly, she heard a familiar voice. "Rachel," said Alexander, approaching her with firm steps, but with a look that, to her surprise, seemed less rigid than usual. "Alexander," she murmured, surprised, trying to hide the nervousness that showed in her expression. He watched her for a moment, as if trying to gauge the depth of her anxiety, and then moved a little closer. "I see you're nervous," he said, bluntly, but without the critical tone she expected. "But that's natural." Rachel forced a smile, but her gaze betrayed her fear of failure. I don't think I'm ready for this. What if I make a mistake? What if it's not enough?" Alexander looked at her, and she felt his penetrating gaze, which somehow managed to be firm and comforting at the same time. "Rachel," he began, with an intensity that made her breath catch, "you've come this far because you have talent and dedication. You've faced greater challenges, and it wasn't by chance that we chose you for this presentation. Do you think we give important opportunities to anyone?" She felt her face heat up as she realized he was right. If they didn't trust their potential, they would never have made that choice. For a moment, his insecurity dissipated, giving way to renewed confidence. Alexander's words carried more than just encouragement. They were a sign that he truly believed in her. "Thank you, sir," she said, in a low voice, but with a sincere tone that carried all her gratitude. Before he walked away, Alexander looked at her one last time, his expression almost soft, but carrying a depth that made her question if there was something more in his gaze. She watched him leave backstage, and her heart was beating fast, but now in a different way. She felt strangely excited, inspired to do her best, not just for Altvoice or the audience, but for herself. When it was her turn to go on stage, Rachel took a deep breath and took the position in front of the microphone. The audience waited in silence, and she could see Alexander and Liam in the front row, both looking intently. He focused on them for a brief moment, as if drawing strength from their support, and then he began reading. Rachel's voice, although shaky at first, soon found a natural rhythm. She let herself be drawn into the text, remembering Liam's words about emotion and Alexander's words about trust. The narrative flowed from her mouth with a force she herself was unaware of. With each sentence, her voice gained intensity, and she could feel the audience immersed in the story, as if the words were painting vivid scenes in front of everyone. At the end, there was a moment of profound silence before applause echoed throughout the room. Rachel could hardly believe what she had just done, but seeing Liam's sincere smile and Alexander's look of approval, she felt a joy that was deeper than anything she had ever experienced. After the event, as people dispersed, Liam ran up to her and pulled her into a warm hug, laughing with delight. "You were amazing. I knew you could do it, Rachel," he exclaimed with an excitement that made her laugh. "Thank you, Liam. You helped me so much with this. I really don't know what I would have done without you," she replied, grateful for all the support and patience he had. Liam watched her with a smile on his lips, but something in his gaze seemed different, deeper. Before he could say anything, Alexander approached, and Liam took a step to the side, the smile still on his face, but now with a touch of something that Rachel couldn't identify. "Congratulations, Rachel," said Alexander, his gaze serious but filled with a pride that she felt was genuine. "You proved to everyone that you can do it." Rachel thanked her, still trying to assimilate Alexander's imposing presence at her side. He remained there for a moment, and she could see the same intense look that was behind the scenes, a look that seemed to see beyond what she was showing. After a brief exchange of glances, Alexander said goodbye and walked away to greet other people, while Liam and Rachel stood there together, watching him. Rachel felt a strange mix of emotions as she watched him leave, as if something had changed between them. But soon her attention was caught by Liam, who was still by her side. "And now, is our star of the night ready to celebrate? I know a great place for dinner," he said, with a warm smile and an expectant look in his eyes. Rachel laughed, still drunk from the adrenaline of the presentation, and accepted the invitation. The two left together, and as they walked through the brightly lit streets, she felt light, as if she had finally found her place, both at work and with someone who truly understood her. Rachel's presentation continued to resonate with Altvoice colleagues and professionals in the days that followed. Her performance not only surprised the team, but also drew praise from influential industry figures who congratulated her on an expressive and engaging read. The positive impact gave her a new confidence, something that everyone around her noticed, especially Liam and Alexander. Each one, in their own way, now seemed to see her in a different light, admiring not only her dedication, but also the talent she previously didn't know she possessed. At the office, Rachel received smiles of greeting and small words of encouragement. Karen made a point of congratulating her, and even colleagues who barely knew her commented on the impact of her reading. She tried to absorb each compliment, still in disbelief at the effect of her presentation. But as much as she felt grateful, a part of her wondered what it really meant. How would your performance change about your work there? And most importantly, how would it affect her relationship with Liam and Alexander, who supported her in such different ways? It was during a coffee break that Liam approached, with the smile she already knew well, and held her hand in a sudden gesture. She felt her face heat up, but he maintained the contact naturally, his eyes shining as if he was as excited as the day of the presentation. "So ma'am, audiobook star, ready for your new career?" He joked, but there was a sincerity in his tone, a true admiration. "You proved to everyone that you have talent. In fact, I told you you were good at it, remember?" Rachel laughed, trying to hide her shyness. Liam had always been relaxed and full of compliments, but the intensity with which he now looked at her brought a new sensation. "I still don't know if I'm good at this," she replied, smiling, "but I think I'm finally starting to believe in myself. And it should. By the way, are we going to dinner today to really celebrate?" "There's no point in saying no, because this time you have no excuses," he said, lightly squeezing her hand. Rachel couldn't refuse the invitation, especially when he looked at her like that. She nodded, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time, and agreed to meet him later. However, as the hours passed and Rachel continued her tasks, she realized there was another lingering thought. Amidst the excitement and nervousness about dinner with Liam, she remembered Alexander, the way he had encouraged her before the presentation, the unexpected confidence, and the intense gaze he had kept on her. That memory intrigued her, and although she didn't want to admit it, the brief smile of pride that Alexander showed after his performance moved her more than she had imagined. Since then, he treated her with the same firmness as always, but Rachel noticed a certain difference. It was something subtle, a more constant attention, as if he was more attentive to her every movement. Later, as she said goodbye to her colleagues and prepared to meet Liam, Rachel was surprised by Alexander, who appeared in the hallway before she left. He called out to her, which made her stop immediately, and she noticed that he seemed to want to say something that went beyond normal work interactions. "Rachel, I have something I would like to discuss with you. Do you have a moment?" He waited until she nodded, then led her to a nearby meeting room. Rachel felt a pang of anxiety as she followed him, not knowing what to expect. As soon as they entered, Alexander closed the door, leaving the room in a silence that seemed even more intimidating than normal. He watched her for a moment, and she almost held her breath, trying to guess the reason for this unexpected meeting. "I wanted to talk about your presentation," he began, his tone neutral but full of intensity. "It was a great job. I knew you had potential, but what you showed was beyond what we imagined." Rachel blinked, surprised by the direct compliment, and felt her face heat up. "Thank you, sir. I'm glad you liked it." Alexander kept his gaze fixed on her, as if trying to gauge her every reaction. "I'm not just saying this to praise," he continued, in a more serious tone. "I want you to consider other performances in the future. Last week's event was just the beginning. We have projects in the works that could benefit from your talent." Rachel felt her heart race. The idea of doing more performances seemed daunting, but Alexander's confidence filled her with enthusiasm. She tried to absorb every word, unable to believe the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Sir, I don't know if I have the same experience as others," she began hesitantly, "but if you think I can contribute, I'll do my best to live up to it." Alexander nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. "I believe he will do it. Remember, Rachel, talent is rare, and you have something special that few others have." His words resonated deeply, and she felt that he truly saw something unique in her. For a moment, Rachel felt the air around her become thicker. Alexander was watching her intensely, and she realized that her own feelings were confused. The admiration he aroused in her seemed to grow, and that simple encounter left her even more intrigued about the man he was. The trust he placed in her had a strength capable of transforming her own view of herself. Alexander walked away after a brief wave and, without prolonging the conversation, left the room, leaving Rachel alone and with a whirlwind of thoughts. She spent a few minutes there, processing what she had heard, trying to understand her own feelings, which oscillated between admiration and curiosity, with a touch of something deeper that she was scared to admit. Finally, when he came back to reality, he remembered his commitment to Liam. He took a deep breath, trying to dissipate the tension that the meeting with Alexander had caused, and headed to the restaurant. When she arrived, she saw that Liam was already waiting for her at a table near the window, with a welcoming smile that brought immediate relief. What there was, he asked, noticing her slight discomfort. It seemed like it was going a mile a minute when it arrived. Rachel laughed, trying not to let it show too much. "I just had an unexpected conversation in the office. No big deal," she said, trying not to reveal the mixed emotions she was carrying. They ordered dishes and talked about the presentation, upcoming projects, and even films and music. Liam maintained a relaxed tone and made funny comments that made her laugh. The lightness of that night helped her forget the tension of meeting Alexander, and she soon let herself be carried away by Liam's good humor and easy charm. While they were talking, he held her hand on the table and, without losing his smile, looked at her more seriously. "Rachel, you know I really believe in you, right? I've seen how hard you've been trying. And look, it was incredible to see you up there, confident, bringing that story to life." She felt her face flush and returned his gaze, surprised by the depth in his words. The way he supported her and believed in her was something that touched her heart, and she couldn't help but think about how important Liam had become to her. They continued the conversation in a lighter mood, and when the night came to an end, he accompanied her to the taxi. Before opening the door for her, he held her hands and looked into her eyes for a long moment, as if he wanted to say something more. "Rachel," he began, his voice lower and softer, "I don't want you to forget how special you are. And I also don't want you to feel like you're alone on this journey." Her heart raced, and for a moment, the closeness between them seemed to suspend time. Liam looked down at her lips, but hesitated, leaving only tension in the air, before pulling away and smiling, as if he wanted to keep the moment in the realm of possibility. Rachel got into the taxi with a confused mind and heart. Liam was everything she admired in a person: generous, funny, understanding. However, Alexander's image was still present, like a shadow that made her uneasy. There was something about him that attracted her, but also scared her, something she still couldn't fully understand. She felt torn between the warmth that Liam brought and the silent intensity that Alexander awakened. Upon arriving home, Rachel threw herself on the sofa, trying to organize her thoughts, but she knew it was in vain. The emotion she felt towards the two confused her more and more, and the uncertainty of how she would deal with this situation became more real. What did you really want? And more importantly, who really owned the space that was growing in his heart? As I stared at the ceiling of the apartment, I knew I was experiencing something that would change everything. As the days went by, the relationship between Rachel and Liam blossomed into an increasingly natural and engaging harmony. Their daily coexistence brought them together in a unique way, and the lightness of the moments with him was something she couldn't ignore. The smiles exchanged, the conversations during the recording sessions, and the constant support made Rachel feel valued and special. Liam encouraged her to explore her potential, praised her ideas, and was always there when she needed her, which created a complicity between them that went beyond work. However, a new and unsettling feeling arose whenever Alexander appeared. Since the introduction, Alexander had been watching her with an attention that Rachel couldn't decipher. He rarely praised her, but he looked at her with a peculiar intensity, as if her every word and gesture had a subtle impact on his state of mind. In meetings, when Rachel spoke, he kept his gaze fixed on her, and Rachel noticed that the atmosphere between them had changed. Alexander seemed unstable around him, as if something in him wavered between admiration and coldness. The confusion between the two sides of this man, so intense and withdrawn at the same time, made Rachel question what he really thought and why he seemed to react so differently whenever he saw her close to Liam. It was on a Monday morning that this implicit tension manifested itself. Alexander had called a team meeting to discuss upcoming audiobook launch projects, and upon entering the room, Rachel noticed that he was looking at her with a mix of curiosity and something darker. Liam arrived a few minutes later and sat down next to Rachel, giving her a casual smile. Sitting between the two men, Rachel felt a charge of different energy in the air, as if something unspoken hovered over them. When the meeting began, Alexander explained the strategies with his usual coolness, and Rachel listened attentively, but every time she gave her opinion or answered a question, he seemed to adopt an unexpectedly harsh tone. Rachel couldn't understand the reason for the sudden hostility, but his every comment carried a calculated coldness, as if he wanted to divert her attention from something. At one point, he mentioned her presentation, offering vague praise but quickly changing the tone to something critical. "Rachel, your reading performance was adequate, but I hope that in the next events you control the intensity better. Excessive enthusiasm could end up damaging your accuracy," said Alexander, with an unreadable expression. Rachel felt her face flush. That sounded like a disguised criticism, something she hadn't expected after all the effort she had made. She felt nervous and embarrassed, not knowing what to say. Liam, noticing her discomfort, gave Alexander a disapproving look. "In my opinion, the performance was exactly what the audience needed, Rachel. It was engaging and full of energy," said Liam, with a slight hint of challenge in his voice. "In fact, I even received comments from colleagues saying it was one of the best readings they had ever heard." Alexander remained silent, his gaze impenetrable. He glanced briefly at Liam, but then looked back at Rachel. "I hope you absorbed what I said, Rachel. We must always seek excellence in every detail." The meeting continued, but Rachel felt torn, confused between Alexander's critical words and Liam's warm support. Why did Alexander seem so dissatisfied with something everyone had praised? What really bothered you? And why did Liam, always careful, now seem to defy him? Rachel knew there was something strange about that dynamic, but she didn't understand what could have caused such a change. Later, when the two were ready to leave the office, Liam invited her to dinner. "Rachel, since we're wrapping up another successful week, what do you think we celebrate? We can go to a restaurant I know. I promise it will be a fun night full of laughter." Rachel smiled, feeling enveloped by the invitation. She liked the way Liam made her feel special, as if every moment with him was a gift. Although he hesitated for a second, he accepted, deciding it would be a good way to forget the discomfort of meeting Alexander. However, as he prepared for dinner later, Alexander's thoughts kept returning. She tried to push him away, but his cold words and distant gaze hovered over her mind. Something about his behavior had moved her in an unexpected way, and at the same time, it intrigued her because it was inexplicable. Why was he so bothered? And why did she feel that he somehow saw her as more than just an employee? At dinner, Liam was, as always, relaxed and fun, making jokes and sharing funny stories about his journey at Altvoice and his past experiences. Rachel laughed at the stories and tried to focus only on that moment, without remembering what she had felt at the meeting. But it was difficult to ignore how much Alexander seemed to weigh on her thoughts. Liam, noticing that she was a little distant, held her hand on the table with a delicate and sincere touch, which made her look at him more attentively. "Rachel, are you really present here? I have a feeling something is troubling you," he said, his tone softer and more direct. "Is it something with work? Or maybe something I should know?" Rachel smiled, trying to ease the weight of the situation. "I'm just thinking about everything that's happened in the last few weeks. Everything has changed so quickly, and sometimes I feel like I'm still adapting." Liam nodded, keeping his eyes open. "I understand, but you know, no matter how much things change, you have people who believe in you. I'm here, Rachel, and I always will be. I want you to know that." She felt a heat rush through her chest at those words. He was sincere, attentive, and always willing to be by her side. For a moment, he thought he should return all the affection and attention that Liam showed. And then, without thinking twice, Rachel leaned slightly over the table and touched his face with her hand, feeling the softness of his skin under her fingers, while their eyes met in an instant of pure connection. Liam moved closer, as if he had been waiting for that moment, and when their lips finally touched, the kiss was delicate, full of feelings that seemed to have been building up since the first day. But as soon as they walked away, a wave of uncertainty hit her. As much as Liam's affection was sincere and true, She couldn't ignore the conflicting feelings that Alexander aroused. The inexplicable jealousy and coldness he had shown deeply disconcerted her, and she wondered what his behavior really meant and why he cared so much about her actions. Rachel knew there was something still unresolved, a tension that seemed to grow between her and Alexander, and that only intensified whenever she and Liam got closer. The next morning, upon arriving at the office, Rachel was again surprised to find Alexander in the hallway. He watched her in silence for a moment before approaching her, and Rachel, unable to control her confusion, waited to see what he had to say. "Rachel," he said, without the critical tone of the previous meeting, but still with that relentless intensity. "I would like to talk to you about the presentation we are organizing for next month. I need you to be prepared to face more challenges from now on." Rachel nodded, trying to understand if the invitation was professional or if there was something more to his words. "Of course, sir. I'll do my best." He held his gaze, and for a moment, Rachel felt he was about to say something more than expected. But instead, Alexander looked away, leaving the air between them charged with an inexplicable tension. Rachel, although confused, felt a spark of empowerment. She didn't want her relationships at work to be defined by ambiguity, so she decided to be honest. "Sir, just to clarify, yesterday, at the meeting, I felt there was something different in your tone. I don't know if I did something wrong, but I want to make sure I'm fully committed." Alexander looked at her with a mixture of surprise and something that looked like admiration. "Rachel, this isn't about your commitment. I know you're here because you deserve to be. I just need you to understand that working here requires a professional attitude above all else," he said, but his voice sounded strangely hesitant. Rachel nodded, thanking him for the explanation, but as she left, something in her remained in a state of uneasiness. I realized that Alexander's words said one thing, but his eyes revealed another. It was clear that something deeper was at play, something he might not be able to admit, and it disturbed her, attracted her, and challenged her. In the following days, work continued at an intense pace, but Rachel found herself increasingly torn between Liam's constant affection and Alexander's imposing presence, who attracted her in a way she still didn't understand. He knew he needed to sort out his own feelings, but at the same time, he was afraid that any decision he made could change the course of everything. That night, dinner with Liam brought Rachel a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Ever since the kiss they had shared, she felt a pleasant tension every time she thought about him. The way Liam looked at her, the safe and warm tone of his voice, the relaxed way he always made her laugh, all of this left her feeling light and full of expectations. But at the same time, a part of Rachel wondered how much she was really committed to this relationship, as there was still something about Alexander that intrigued her deeply. Liam was waiting for her in a cozy restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, lit by candles and with an intimate atmosphere that seemed perfect for a special date. When Rachel arrived, Liam stood up, smiling with a contagious energy. He was casual, but with a natural elegance that made him even more charming. His eyes sparkled when he saw her, and Rachel couldn't help but return the smile, already feeling the lightness he always managed to bring. "You look amazing," Liam said as soon as she sat down. The compliment took her by surprise, and she smiled, feeling a good warmth in her chest. "Thank you," she replied, feeling both flattered and a little nervous. "I'm glad we arranged this dinner. I think we deserve this time together." Liam nodded, pouring wine for both of them, and soon the conversations flowed naturally. He was an excellent storyteller, and each situation he described was accompanied by expressions and gestures that made everything more vivid. Rachel laughed as he narrated some funny episodes from his career as a narrator, especially from his early days, when he made small mistakes and felt insecure. "There was one time when I completely changed the order of the chapters in the recording, and the editor only noticed after sending the audio to the client. Imagine the confusion," he said, with an expression of mock horror. Rachel laughed, delighted by his casualness, but also by his honesty. It was easy to open up to Liam. He created an environment where everything seemed simple and joyful. At that moment, Rachel felt that with him, she could have a light life, without the complications and mysteries that haunted her when she was close to Alexander. As dinner continued, Rachel noticed that Liam's gaze became deeper, more intense. He seemed to watch her not just with curiosity, but with an affection that left her both nervous and enchanted. When his fingers touched hers on the table, Rachel felt an electricity run through her body, but she maintained contact, feeling that the moment was right to explore this feeling that was growing between them. "Rachel, I know our relationship started out professionally, but..." Liam hesitated, searching for the right words as he kept his gaze fixed on hers. "I want you to know that being by your side has been special. I've been feeling something that I can't ignore." His words touched her, and she found herself torn between the desire to dive into that feeling and the weight of a doubt that she couldn't shake. He was about to respond when he felt a familiar presence at his side, an energy that sent a chill down his spine. He glanced over, and there was Alexander standing next to his desk. He wore an impeccable dark suit and maintained a calm expression, but his gaze fixed on her with intensity. Rachel felt the air around her shift, as if there was an invisible current of tension connecting the three of them. Liam noticed Alexander's presence, and although he maintained his composure, Rachel noticed a slight stiffening in his expression, as if a shadow of defiance appeared on his face. "Good evening, Rachel," Liam greeted Alexander, his tone polite, but with a firmness that seemed to disguise something deeper. "Surprised to see you here. I didn't know you two were scheduled to meet outside of work." Rachel felt the pressure of Alexander's gaze, and her throat tightened. He had appeared unexpectedly, almost as if he had sensed he was there. His presence destabilized her, especially next to Liam, who now kept his gaze fixed on Alexander, as if he were ready to confront him. Liam, although he was normally laid back, didn't let Alexander intimidate him. "Yes, we decided to leave the office for a while to relax. The atmosphere has been a little tense lately, don't you think?" he replied, with a touch of subtle irony that Rachel picked up on immediately. Alexander showed no reaction, but his expression hardened slightly. "Of course, it's important to relax," he replied, keeping an intense gaze on Rachel. "By the way, Rachel, we're finalizing some details on upcoming projects. We'll need to line this up later. I thought it was important to remember, even after hours." Rachel felt pressured, and Alexander's words, although professional, carried an emotional charge that she couldn't ignore. There was a subtext in those words, something that seemed to say he wasn't indifferent to her relationship with Liam, and she felt that. No matter how much Alexander tried to maintain the facade of the distant and objective CEO, something in him stirred every time he saw her with Liam. When Alexander finally pulled away, the silence between Rachel and Liam became thick. She felt the discomfort and tension settle in, while Liam looked at her with a serious expression, as if trying to understand what was really between her and Alexander. "Rachel, you and Alexander, is there something going on that I should know about?" The question was direct, and Liam watched her with cautious expectation, but without hiding the slight concern that his eyes revealed. Rachel hesitated, searching for the right words. "No, Liam. Alexander is he's demanding and complicated, but that's just the job." However, she herself could not be sure that this was the complete truth. There was something about Alexander that intrigued and attracted her, something that moved her, but she couldn't explain it. Nor did she want to reveal this to Liam, who treated her with so much affection and care. Liam nodded, but she noticed he didn't look entirely convinced. Even so, he didn't force the conversation to go any further and relaxed again, trying to move the dinner forward and restore the pleasant atmosphere they had been building before the interruption. The night continued with lighter conversations, but Alexander's presence seemed to persist, like an invisible shadow that surrounded them and that Rachel was unable to dispel. At the end of dinner, Liam walked her to the restaurant door and suddenly held her hand firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "Rachel, I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what," he said, his voice lower and thick with emotion. "I know you have choices to make, but I don't want you to have any doubts about how I feel." She felt her heart tighten at those words. Liam was a good man, a support amid all the confusion of his professional and personal life. But Alexander's presence continued to haunt his mind. Even after meeting Liam, Alexander's figure appeared in her mind, as if it were an enigma waiting to be deciphered. That night, Rachel found herself alone in her apartment, lost in thought. Liam's sincere affection contrasted with Alexander's enigmatic intensity, and both awakened distinct but equally strong feelings in her. The likeness next to Liam was like a breath of fresh air, a promise of simple, safe happiness. Alexander, on the other hand, was a mystery, a challenge that seemed to attract her, awakening emotions she had never experienced. She felt torn, as if her heart and mind were pulling her in opposite directions. I knew I would need to make a choice, but at the same time I feared the consequences of any decision. In the days following her unexpected encounter with Alexander at the restaurant, Rachel noticed that his presence at work seemed even more intense and quietly unsettling. It was as if the fine line between professionalism and personal tension was broken every time their eyes met. Alexander maintained his usual control and posture, but Rachel noticed something fragile and hidden behind that firm facade. While trying to focus on work and recording, Rachel was also dealing with Liam's growing affection, which became increasingly sincere and constant. Liam's support warmed her, but Alexander was always on her mind, a mystery that seemed to challenge her to solve. On more than one occasion, when leaving the studio and seeing him in his office, she caught a look from him that was no longer that of the cold, observant boss, but that of someone who held something beyond the surface, a mix of pain and resistance that disconcerted her. It was during a rainy afternoon when Corinne asked Rachel to help organize some old Outvoice project documents that Rachel unexpectedly found a piece to this puzzle. In the midst of boxes and stacks of filed papers, she came across an old magazine article about the company. Alexander's face graced the cover, younger, but with the same determined and strong look that he still carried. However, the article, published years ago, reported an event that involved Alexander and explained, in part, the ruthless image he had built over the years. Upon reading the article, Rachel discovered that, a few years earlier, Alexander had experienced a personal tragedy that had profoundly shaken his life. His father, who was one of the founders of Outvoice, had struggled with mental health issues for years, struggling with severe depression that ultimately led him to make financial decisions that nearly ruined the company. Alexander, then in his early 20s, took control to save the family legacy. He rebuilt Outvoice, but at the cost of his own youth and an emotional peace that he may never regain. Furthermore, the loss of his father, who had moved away from the family and then passed away, had left a deep mark on Alexander. Rachel fell silent as she read that, and her heart sank as she imagined the weight Alexander carried from such a young age. She now understood in part why he was so reserved and strict. The responsibility of saving the company had made him mature too soon, transforming him into a man who could not allow himself to be vulnerable. All of that was reflected in the calculated coldness of his behavior, in his direct responses, and in the way he kept everyone at a distance. When she finished reading the article, Rachel leaned back in her chair, absorbing the information, and felt a new wave of empathy for Alexander. She could understand why he preferred to hide his emotions and lock himself in a shell of perfectionism. I felt that, behind that meticulous and demanding man, there was a wounded soul that refused to let anyone get close. Later that afternoon, Alexander called Rachel into his office to discuss a new project. She walked in, still processing what she had discovered, and when she saw him, she felt a mixture of respect and admiration. He looked at her with his usual firm expression, but somehow his gaze seemed to carry a different tension, as if he sensed that something was changing between them. "Rachel," he began, turning back to the computer screen as he spoke, "we need to prepare for next month's presentation. The team is already developing the initial scripts, but I would like you and Liam to coordinate the review and ensure the clarity of the texts. This will be a high-profile project." She nodded, trying to keep her tone professional. "Understood, sir. Let's go over the details and make sure everything is perfect." Alexander nodded, but instead of ending the conversation, he watched her for a second longer, as if trying to read what was going on behind her serene face. Rachel noticed the look and, without knowing exactly what motivated her, asked in a soft and cautious tone, "Sir, can I ask you a question? Something personal?" He seemed to hesitate for a moment, but his expression remained neutral. "Depends on the question," he replied in a light warning tone. but one that also carried a certain curiosity. Rachel took a deep breath, remembering the weight of his past. "I just wanted to say that I admire what you did for Altvoice. I know it required a huge personal sacrifice, and maybe not everyone realizes how significant that is." Alexander looked surprised, and his face broke for a moment, revealing a rare vulnerability. "I see you've been informing yourself," he said, his voice now lower, without the defensive tone she expected. "But it's not something I mention, and I'd rather things in the past stay where they are." Rachel nodded, respecting his position, but unable to hide the touch of understanding in her eyes. "Of course, sir. I didn't mean to overstep any boundaries. I just think it's important to recognize what you did, and that maybe, in the end, not everyone understands the weight of it." For a moment, Alexander was silent, as if he was processing those words. There was something about Rachel that seemed to break down the carefully constructed barriers around him, and he knew she could see beyond the image she projected. "Rachel," he began, his voice almost a whisper, "sometimes the choices we make shape us who we are, for better or for worse. I chose to protect what my father built, but it cost me." His words hit her hard, and she realized that this moment was more than a glimpse into his past. It was a revelation about the man he was, someone who sacrificed his peace for an ideal, and who lived in the shadow of that choice to this day. Alexander looked away, as if he regretted having said so much, but Rachel, touched by his vulnerability, wanted to show that he was not alone in this burden. "I know it's hard to leave these things behind, but know that what you did was noble, and that says a lot about the man you are." His gaze met hers, intense and enigmatic, as if trying to unravel the layers of understanding and empathy she offered. Alexander seemed inclined to say something more, but soon regained his firm stance, ending the conversation with a brief wave, as if reluctant to let the moment deepen any further. As she left the office, Rachel carried with her a new perception about Alexander. He was not just the stern and demanding boss, but a man who had sacrificed his own peace in the name of a family legacy. Someone who bore invisible scars and, perhaps because of that, kept people at a distance. She understood now why he was so reserved and solitary, and felt that, in some way, this explained his fascination with her. Rachel felt an attraction to him that went beyond his physique or imposing presence. It was a deeper connection, as if she were one of the few people able to see the real Alexander. As this understanding grew in her heart, Rachel also found herself torn between safety and affection from Liam, who continued to show constant support and affection. Liam was someone who made her laugh, who made her feel light, and who saw her as a partner. He didn't carry the weight of the past or the shadows of Alexander, but there was something pure and sincere, something that attracted her and made her feel protected. However, next to Alexander, Rachel felt challenged, as if he were an enigma that she needed to unravel, a mystery that made her want to discover every hidden piece of his soul. In the days that followed, Rachel tried to balance these two opposing forces that pulled her in such different ways. She spent her days at Liam's side, feeling the lightness of his affection. But at the same time, she longed for the moments when she met Alexander, moments that, although brief and contained, were filled with an intensity and depth that consumed her. The tension increased with each interaction between them, especially in situations where she needed to be by both of their sides. She felt torn, as if part of her longed for the security and warmth that Liam offered, while another, deeper, more intense part was drawn to Alexander's complexity and darkness. And as these conflicting emotions intensified, Rachel realized that, sooner or later, she would have to choose between these two very different but equally strong feelings. As the days passed, Rachel felt her heart in a real turmoil. Every time she went out to dinner or spent quiet moments with Liam, a feeling of comfort and happiness came over her, as if they were building a safe space, away from the pressures and mysteries that permeated work at Altvoice. Liam was an incredible companion, always attentive, willing to make her laugh and understand her in every detail. And next to him, she could relax, be herself without reservation, let herself be carried away by the warmth of sincere affection and the promises of a simple and happy life. However, as soon as these moments passed, the figure of Alexander appeared in her mind with a disturbing intensity. He was like a lingering shadow, a presence that challenged her emotions and made her question what she truly wanted. With Alexander, things were anything but easy. Every encounter with him was filled with irresistible tension, and his reserved expression, deep voice, and rare glimpses of vulnerability made him a living mystery. A man she knew she could never fully understand, but couldn't walk away from. Rachel's interactions with Alexander became increasingly complex and confusing. He looked at her enigmatically, as if he knew she was going through an internal conflict, but at the same time, he maintained a distance that seemed designed to prevent her from getting too close. Still, whenever the two discussed projects or spent time alone in the meeting room, she noticed in Alexander an attentive silence, a look that seemed to ask to be unveiled. It was a deeper, almost inexplicable attraction, and Rachel felt pulled toward him in a way that defied logic. It was something that intrigued and fascinated her, an enigma that seemed to wait for her in every silent moment between them. One afternoon, while reviewing scripts alongside Liam, Rachel was overcome by an unexpected wave of guilt. Liam was so present, so available, and his easy smile, his uncomplicated manner, were exactly what she had always imagined as ideal in a partner. He was someone who made her happy in a simple and constant way, and she knew that the feeling was reciprocal. However, in the back of his mind, the thought of Alexander remained, like a flame that refused to go out. Rachel tried to fight it, but resistance seemed futile. There was something about Alexander that exerted a strange power over her, and this power made her distance herself, little by little, from Liam, even if she didn't want to. In the following days, Rachel realized that, without meaning to, she was starting to move away emotionally from Liam. In encounters that previously made her anxious and excited, she now felt slight hesitation. It wasn't Liam's fault, and she knew it. He was being the same, always affectionate and attentive, but it was as if her own heart was in conflict, divided between two opposing forces that demanded a decision from her. This internal conflict made her feel a pain that she often couldn't explain. The guilt began to grow because next to Liam, she felt like someone who was betraying the sincerity of his affection by having such intense thoughts about another person. One Friday night, after a quieter dinner than usual, Liam walked her home. He seemed to notice Rachel's gradual withdrawal, but he didn't say anything along the way, remaining quiet, just exchanging a few brief words. When he arrived in front of her building, he held her hand firmly and looked into her eyes, as if trying to understand what was going on. "Rachel, I feel like you've been distant lately," he said, his voice soft but filled with genuine concern. "I don't want to pressure you, but I'm here. If something's wrong, I'd like to know." Rachel felt her chest tighten and looked away for a moment, feeling a growing guilt. She knew Liam was being sincere, that he respected her deeply and didn't want to invade her space, but his presence, at that moment, made her feel exposed. Part of her wanted to tell the truth, to confess that she was torn, that she couldn't keep Alexander from her thoughts, but she was afraid of hurting Liam more than she was already hurting by remaining silent. "Liam, you are one of the most important people to me," she said, trying to be honest. "I just need some time to understand some things. I've been going through a whirlwind of feelings and I still don't know how to deal with it." Liam nodded, his expression serene, but with a touch of pain in his eyes that Rachel couldn't ignore. He seemed to understand, but at the same time, he was clearly hurt. It was as if he understood, even without her saying it directly, that there was something beyond him that occupied her heart. "I understand, Rachel," he said, trying to smile but unable to completely disguise the sadness in his voice. "I just want you to know that I'm willing to wait, if it means being with you." Rachel felt the tears build up and hugged him, trying to convey all the affection and gratitude she felt for him. But at the same time, he knew that his heart was divided and that it was unfair to Liam. As much as she wanted to be whole for him, there was something about Alexander that seemed to keep her trapped in an invisible thread, a connection she couldn't break, no matter how hard she tried. The next morning, Rachel went to the office earlier than usual, looking for some peace. He felt like he needed to organize his own feelings before he ended up hurting Liam even more. However, When he arrived, he found Alexander in the hallway, looking equally thoughtful. He watched her for a moment and, noticing her worried expression, made a slight gesture for her to follow him to the office. Alexander closed the door and approached with a serious look that, at the same time, had an unexpected softness. Rachel felt the intensity of his gaze and knew, instinctively, that he sensed the internal struggle she was facing. "Rachel," he began, his voice low but firm, "I realize you're going through something that concerns you. I don't want to invade your privacy, but I'm here if you need to talk about it." His words, although formal, carried genuine concern, something Rachel was not used to hearing from Alexander. She hesitated, knowing that any word might reveal more than she wanted. But the intensity of the moment was almost overwhelming. She looked at him, feeling her heart race, and finally allowed a part of her truth to escape. "Alexander, you are an intense presence," she began, searching for the right words. "And it makes me feel things I can't explain. You're someone I admire, but also someone who challenges me, who makes me question things that once seemed clear." Alexander stared at her in silence, his gaze impenetrable, but with a depth that seemed to understand everything she couldn't say. He took a step towards her, keeping his expression firm, but his silence said more than any words could express. She felt that he was fighting something, an invisible barrier that prevented any vulnerability from showing. But at the same time, there was a desire in him to get closer, a contained desire. "Rachel," he said finally, his voice deep and almost a whisper, "do you know why I keep this distance between myself and people? Because the last time I allowed myself to be vulnerable, I lost everything. Since then, I've convinced myself that I needed to keep everyone away, that it was safer. But you..." He stopped, as if weighing his words, and continued, "You are someone who challenges me to be different." Rachel felt a wave of emotions that hit her hard, a mixture of understanding and attraction that was impossible to ignore. Those words revealed that, behind the strong and impenetrable man, there was someone who feared his own past, who fought against a chosen but painful loneliness. Rachel knew she couldn't solve Alexander's pain, but at that moment, she wanted to be by his side in some way, to show him that he didn't need to carry everything alone. Yet at the same time, she felt Liam's weight on her mind, his affection and loyalty, and the guilt of sharing her heart between two very different men consumed her. She approached Alexander, feeling attracted by a force she couldn't explain, and the two remained silent, just exchanging a look full of intense and contained feelings. Without another word, Rachel backed away, unable to handle the depth of that moment. She knew she was at a crucial point, a crossroads where any decision would take her down a path of no return. Leaving Alexander's office, she felt torn, not knowing exactly where her heart would take her, but understanding that, sooner or later, she would need to face her feelings and choose between Liam's safe love and his irresistible, mysterious allure. By Alexander, that night, an unexpected call shook Rachel's world. She was at home, immersed in confused thoughts about the divided feelings between Liam and Alexander, when the insistent ringing of her cell phone took her out of her reverie. It was an unknown number, but something in her instinct made her answer it immediately. On the other side, a serious voice reported that Liam had been in a car accident and was on his way to the hospital. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet, a wave of panic and fear coursing through her body as she tried to process the news. Without wasting any time, Rachel grabbed her keys and left the house in a hurry. During the journey to the hospital, his heart was beating wildly, and chaotic thoughts filled his mind. Liam, who had always been her support, her friend, her fun partner who brightened her days. The idea that something serious could have happened to him terrified her. The fear of losing someone so important was mixed with a deep guilt, knowing that, in the last few days, he had been left aside while she drowned in her own emotional conflict. When she arrived at the hospital, Rachel was immediately directed to the emergency waiting room. After a long time of anguish, a doctor finally approached to inform her about Liam's condition. He had suffered a broken leg and some cuts and bruises, but was fortunately out of danger. Rachel felt overwhelming relief knowing he would survive, but the tears running down her face showed how much the fear of losing him had affected her. The doctor explained that he would need considerable time to recover, but that she could see him once he was stabilized. Minutes later, Rachel entered the room where Liam was lying, her face pale and a little bruised, but with a slight smile that reassured her. Upon seeing her, his eyes shone with surprise and delight, as if her presence was the medicine he most craved. "Rachel," he murmured, his voice weak but full of gratitude. "You came. I didn't know if I should bother you." She approached him, holding his hand carefully, and felt the pain and affection mix in his chest. "Liam, you would never bother me. I was terrified. I can't imagine what I would do if something more serious had happened to you." He smiled, still with a tired expression, and lightly squeezed her hand. "Well, at least I'm here, with some scratches and a broken leg. Nothing you can't overcome." His attempt to keep his tone light was evident, but Rachel could see the fear hidden behind the smile. That night, Rachel stayed by Liam's side, monitoring his recovery and making sure he had everything he needed. As he slept, she watched him, reflecting on how much he meant to her and the pain she felt at the thought of losing him. She was there for him, as he had always been for her. Every moment of care and attention he had offered her now seemed to come back to her, reminding her of how important Liam was and how he brought something undeniably good to her life. Over the next few hours, as doctors and nurses came and went to monitor Liam's condition, Rachel almost forgot about the outside world. But it was when a nurse informed her that someone was waiting to see her in the hallway that she was ripped away from the little universe of care and relief she shared with Liam. Upon leaving the room, he met Alexander, who was standing in the hallway, his arms crossed and his expression subdued, but with concern evident in his eyes. "Rachel," he said, his voice soft and serious, looking at her in a way that seemed to convey understanding and expectation at the same time. "I heard about Liam's accident, and I figured you'd be here." She nodded, trying to maintain her composure, but his presence, even here in the hospital, was capable of provoking conflicting feelings. "Yes, he is stable now, but it was a huge scare. I couldn't think of anything other than being by his side." Alexander nodded, watching her with careful intensity. "I'm relieved to know he's out of danger. I know he means a lot to you," he said in a deep voice, but without any judgmental tone. The words sounded almost like a surrender, as if he recognized, even if grudgingly, the bond that existed between Rachel and Liam. Rachel felt a touch of sadness deep in her heart. She knew that Alexander was trying to respect that moment, but she also realized that he saw much more than she was prepared to admit. There, in the silence between them, there seemed to be a silent exchange of confessions and suppressed feelings. A silent understanding that, however strong the connection between her and Alexander was, there was something in Liam that demanded an immediate and sincere response from her. Next to Alexander, she experienced mystery, intensity, and the irresistible fascination of unraveling it. But next to Liam, everything became clear and honest. A space where she could simply be Rachel, without questions or insecurities. Alexander looked at her with silent respect and took a step back, as if to make it clear that she had the freedom to choose where she wanted to be. "Rachel, take good care of him. I know he's important." His words, so simple but filled with deep meaning, left her emotional. It was as if, for the first time, Alexander was allowing her to see a side of himself that he preferred to hide. Someone who, despite everything, wanted her happiness, even if it meant giving up something he might have wanted in secret. Rachel felt the tears build up, touched by the understanding and acceptance that Alexander showed, even without having to say much. The intensity of that moment was almost painful, but she smiled in gratitude, trying to convey how much his attitude meant to her. Alexander nodded, looking at her one last time before saying goodbye and walking slowly down the hallway, disappearing around the corner. Rachel stood still for a few seconds, feeling the weight of that silent goodbye and the depth of the dillrickle in her heart. Alexander had chosen to give her space, recognizing how she felt about Liam, and that attitude only confirmed what she had always known. He was more complex than any image others had of him. Upon returning to Liam's room, Rachel found him awake, with a weak but sincere smile upon seeing her again. He looked at her with a mix of relief and affection, as if she were his anchor at that moment. "You really stayed here all this time?" he asked with an emotional expression. Rachel nodded, approaching the bed and holding his hand again. "Of course, Liam. There's no other place I would rather be." His eyes shone with gratitude, and he held her hand tighter, as if trying to reassure himself that this was real, that she was there with him, present and willing to be by his side. That night, as Liam slept, Rachel remained by his side, but thoughts continued to swirl within her. Alexander's visit and the way he handled the situation touched her deeply, revealing a side of him that, in its quiet intensity, only increased the conflict in her heart. With Liam, there was the promise of genuine, pure, warm love, someone who cared about her without reservation. But Alexander, with his depth and constant enigma, was a representation of something more risky and unexplored, an intensity that attracted her and that seemed to promise a very different life experience. Rachel knew she couldn't remain divided forever. Liam was there, vulnerable, needing her, and the affection between them was undeniable. But the shadow of Alexander, of her past, and the unexpressed desire he seemed to carry, continued to occupy a space in her heart that she didn't know how to ignore. The choice, she knew, would not be easy. Rachel's return to work after Liam's accident was marked by constant unrest. Although she wanted to dedicate herself entirely to the project she and Liam had started together, every time the two of them were alone in the studio, she felt a weight that was impossible to ignore. Liam was more sensitive, clearly grateful for her presence at the hospital, and hopeful that this gesture was a sign that she would choose to stay by his side. However, Rachel felt that something had been lost. The affection she felt for him was real, but it couldn't fill the gap of uncertainty in her heart. Each exchange of glances with Liam made Rachel more aware that she wasn't ready to make a definitive choice yet. And while her bond with him oscillated between affection and a growing guilt for not fully responding to what he felt, Alexander's figure remained in the shadow of everything he did. She remembered the look on his face in the hospital, his understanding, and even an apparent acceptance of her love for Liam, as if he himself had stepped back, respecting the possibility of Rachel being happy with someone else. However, this attitude only made things more difficult for her. Alexander's departure left her with more questions than answers, and the space he left was as deep and uncomfortable as the enigmatic presence he had always had over her. That afternoon, after a long period of reflection and internal debate, Rachel decided it was time to take a break for herself, to step away not only from Liam and Alexander, but also from the confusing feelings that kept her torn. It was time to center himself, to reconnect with his ambitions and seek a path where he could understand who he really was without depending on the emotions and conflicts awakened by these two men. Altvoice remained the most important project of her life, and she knew that her work there was something that really made sense, something that depended solely on her own effort and dedication. So, after a long day of reviews and meetings, Rachel decided she needed to set boundaries to give herself the space she needed. The next morning, before Liam arrived, Rachel asked to talk to him in the meeting room. He looked hopeful when he saw her, but she soon noticed his expression change when she noticed the seriousness on his face. "Liam," she began, her voice low and hesitant, "I need to tell you something, and I hope you understand me." He watched her in silence, trying to prepare himself for what was to come, but his gaze already reflected the apprehension of someone who knew the words he would hear could be painful. Rachel took a deep breath and continued, feeling the weight of guilt and the need to be honest. "I care about you very much," she said, her voice full of sincerity. "You have been one of the most important people to me since I joined Altvoice, and what we felt is something I will never forget. But I feel like right now I need some time. I need to focus on myself, on understanding what I really want." Liam held her hand, his eyes showing a mixture of surprise and pain. "Rachel, I understand that you need space, but does that mean you're going to move away from us? From everything we've built?" Rachel felt her heart tighten, but she knew she couldn't run away. "Liam, I can't go on without understanding who I am and what I really want. If I continue to be divided, I'm being unfair to you, to both of us. You deserve someone who can be with you body and soul." He nodded slowly, seeming to absorb the words, although his sad expression made it clear that it affected him deeply. "I will respect your decision, Rachel," he said, his voice low but with a determined tone. "But I want you to know that I'll be here, even if you need some time for yourself." Rachel nodded, feeling gratitude mixed with pain. He hugged her, a long, silent hug that seemed to represent both a farewell and a promise. She knew she was doing what she needed to do, but the weight of her choice was almost unbearable. That same day, Rachel also reached out to Alexander, determined to be honest and make it clear that while there was a strong connection between them, she wasn't ready to explore anything beyond a professional relationship. When she met Alexander in his office, he looked at her with that enigmatic, impenetrable look, but she noticed a gleam of expectation in his eyes. "Alexander, I needed to talk to you," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. He just nodded, crossing his arms and waiting for her to continue. "Over the last few months, you've made me see a lot, and I want you to know that I deeply admire who you are and everything you stand for. But right now, I need to focus on myself, my work, and understand where I'm really at." Searching. Alexander didn't say anything right away, but his silence was more expressive than any words. He watched Rachel with a wary expression, as if he were evaluating the depth of every word she said. Finally, he spoke in a serious and restrained tone. "I understand, and I respect that. I won't deny that your presence has become important to me, Rachel. But of course you must do what you feel you need to do." She felt relief mixed with a strange sadness when she heard that. She was aware that Alexander had always been an enigma, someone difficult to access, but his words now revealed a touch of resignation that moved her. She knew he was giving her the space she asked for, but at the same time, she realized that this choice wasn't easy for him. "Thank you, Alexander," she said, with a slight but genuine smile. "I hope we can maintain a solid professional relationship and that we can continue working together." He nodded one last time, his face expressionless but with a slight nod that she interpreted as encouragement. Alexander did not try to dissuade her, nor did he seek a different answer. He just accepted her decision with the same seriousness she had expected, respecting her choice to step away to find her own path. In the days that followed, Rachel dove headfirst into work. "I spent hours reviewing scripts, taking care of every detail and coordinating teams with intense dedication. Outvoice became her sole focus, and she began to see her work in a new way, with an independence she hadn't had until then. With the time he previously devoted to his conflicting feelings, he now focused on creating something that represented his effort and talent. The feeling of freedom was mixed with a certain loneliness, but she felt that this was the necessary path. The silence between her, Liam, and Alexander became increasingly heavy. Although Liam looked at her with longing and a clear melancholy, he respected the space she had asked for, even if his smile was rarer and the dialogues between the two were briefer. Alexander, in turn, remained professional and distant, as if he had accepted that she had decided to follow her own path. He avoided personal interactions, and the complicity they previously seemed to share gave way to a respectful coldness, which in a way made Rachel realize how much he truly respected her choice. But at the same time, Rachel knew that this distance took an emotional toll on everyone. Even though the decision to focus on herself strengthened her, the void left by Liam and Alexander's separation made her constantly question herself. Both had become such a part of her life that now, without them, she felt incomplete. It was as if she was finally discovering herself, but at the cost of losing the affection and closeness of those who mattered most to her. A few weeks passed, and during a team meeting, Rachel noticed that both Alexander and Liam were watching her closely. They maintained professionalism, but the tension was almost palpable. She realized that her decision to walk away was starting to affect the balance between them, and it was making her uneasy. He knew that, at some point, he would need to face his feelings head-on, but for now, he just tried to stay focused on work. Later, alone in the office, Rachel reflected on the path she had chosen. He knew it was the right decision, but still, the Dilrickle in his heart remained. Liam was a safe haven, a love that made her feel loved and understood. But Alexander, with his intensity and mystery, continued to occupy a space that no distance or decision could completely fill. The feeling of being torn was almost unbearable, but Rachel knew that only time could help her sort out what she felt. She would need to allow herself to feel and understand who she really was before opening her heart again. As difficult as it was, I was willing to face that temporary loneliness in search of a deeper understanding of what I really wanted. One rainy morning, Rachel arrived at the office to find an envelope on her desk with her name written in Liam's distinctive handwriting. At first, his heart raced. She had been keeping a careful distance from him for weeks, and an unexpected letter could only mean he had something important to say. He felt a mixture of fear and hope as he ran his fingers over the paper, hesitating for a few seconds before finally opening it. "Rachel, I write this letter because I realize that the silence between us is starting to become a wall, something that separates us more than it should. I know you need time and that you are trying to find answers within yourself, and I want you to know that I deeply respect that. But I also feel like I need to be honest, not because of pressure or to rush you, but so you know exactly what it meant to me. Since the day I met you, your presence has brought new light into my life. By your side, I feel like the world is lighter, simpler, and honestly, I didn't know I could feel that way with someone. The time we spent together taught me that loving someone means, above all, giving them space when needed, even if it's painful. I know your quest is important to you, and I want you to complete it. But I wanted you to know that I will be here, waiting for you, when you are ready to look at us without a doubt. Take care, Rachel, and remember, no matter how long it takes, the place next to you is the only place I want to be." With all the affection in the world, Liam. When she finished reading, Rachel felt tears run down her face. The simplicity and sincerity of Liam's words touched her deeply. She knew how difficult this must be for him, how much he must be suffering to muster up the courage and express his feelings without demanding anything in return. Liam was, without a doubt, someone who made her feel loved and respected in a way she had never experienced before. But even in the face of such an open confession, there was still a restlessness in her chest, a feeling that she wasn't ready to fully immerse herself in this love, no matter how safe and sweet it was. For the rest of the day, Rachel carried Liam's letter with her as a silent reminder that no matter how confused her feelings were, there was someone who would wait for her, even in the face of all the uncertainty. Amid the whirlwind of work and emotions, he found renewed strength to continue his personal search, to understand what he really wanted and to find himself before returning to what, deep down, he felt could be true love. Later that afternoon, while organizing some documents in the office, she was surprised by a message from Alexander asking her to stop by his office. She felt a wave of anxiety and curiosity, although he had respected her request for space. Rachel noticed that Alexander continued to observe her from afar, maintaining a respectful distance, but never failing to convey a veiled intensity. She entered his office, and Alexander watched her enter with a serious look, as if what he had to say was as important as it was necessary. They sat down, and the silence that preceded the conversation only increased the feeling that something significant was about to be revealed. "Rachel," he began, his voice low but firm, as if trying to organize the words before letting them out. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened over the last few months. About us, about how I feel about you. And I think it's time to be honest, even if it's difficult." He looked at her, and Rachel noticed a rare vulnerability in his gaze, a kind of hesitation that she never expected to see in such a controlled man. "From the beginning, you awakened something in me that I didn't even know existed anymore," he continued. "My life has always been built around walls and control. Everything I do is planned so that I don't have to deal with uncertainties and weaknesses. But you made me see that maybe it's time for a change." Rachel was silent, absorbing every word. Alexander was exposing himself in a way she never imagined possible. Seeing him there, so human, so sincere, made her feel deep empathy. He continued, his voice now lower and more tense, as if he were confessing something he had kept to himself for a long time. "The trauma I carry, from the loss of my father and the decisions I had to make, became a kind of shield, something I used to justify all the choices I made since then. I never allowed myself to be vulnerable with anyone, but now I realize that this choice only took me away from what really matters. And to be honest, I feel like I'm tired of running." He looked at her with an intense and direct gaze. Rachel felt a wave of emotion and compassion go through her, because she knew how difficult it was for him to admit those words, how much he was exposing himself there, in front of her, as someone who also needed a new beginning. "Rachel," he continued, with a sincerity that touched her deeply, "I want you to know that if you're ever ready for this, I'll be here. And most importantly, I am willing to face whatever it takes to overcome my past, so that we can, perhaps, build something together. I'm not asking for an answer right now, but I need you to know that I don't want to live in what happened anymore." The silence that followed seemed full of meaning. Rachel felt her heart racing and her mind in a whirlwind of thoughts. Liam offered her the tranquility, security, and patience of unconditional love, willing to wait without demanding anything. But Alexander brought an intensity and a promise of transformation that, frightening as they were, made her feel alive, as if he were a part of herself she hadn't yet fully explored. She finally found the strength to speak, trying to keep her voice steady. "Alexander, I really appreciate your honesty. I know how difficult it was for you to open up like this, but to be honest, I also need time. I need to understand who I am and what I really want before I commit to any of you." Alexander nodded, respecting her answer, although Rachel could see he wasn't satisfied. However, he looked at her with an expression of acceptance and understanding, as if he knew that her process of self-discovery was something he could not rush. "I understand," he said, finally, "and if that time is what you need, then that's what you'll get." Rachel felt a mix of gratitude and relief, but also a contained sadness. He knew that this moment of honesty was rare, and that, in other circumstances, it could have been a definitive milestone between them. But she wasn't ready to embrace what Alexander offered, just as she wasn't ready to accept Liam's unconditional love. She knew that there was still a long road of discovery ahead of her, and that she would need to travel it alone to find the truth within herself. That night, upon returning home, Rachel sat on the couch, rereading Liam's letter and remembering Alexander's every word. Both men, so different, offered her opposite but equally intense paths. With Liam, the certainty of constant and patient love. With Alexander, the promise of a complex journey, but full of passion and transformation. And while their words resonated in her mind, Rachel understood that, before deciding between the two, she would need to resolve something much more important: her relationship with herself. The morning she decided to resolve the whirlwind of feelings she was carrying once and for all, Rachel felt both relieved and anxious. He had dedicated himself to work for weeks on end, avoiding facing what he knew he would need to do sooner or later. But that day, when he looked in the mirror, he understood that the choice had already been made, even if he hadn't fully admitted it. It was time to confront her own feelings and be honest with both Liam and Alexander. Her first date was with Liam. She invited him for a walk in a park near the office. "I wanted a calm atmosphere where they could talk away from the eyes of colleagues and without the formality of the office walls." Liam accepted the invitation with a slightly anxious smile, as if sensing the depth of the conversation to come. The two walked in silence for a few minutes, absorbing the light breeze and the tranquility of the park. Rachel wasn't sure how to start, but she knew she couldn't put it off any longer. "Liam," she began, feeling the words slip out slowly, "you know how important your presence has been to me in recent months. The affection I have for you is something I never imagined I would feel. Your letter touched me deeply, and knowing that I can count on you at all times is one of the most beautiful things I've ever experienced." Liam stopped walking and looked at her intensely, almost pleadingly, as if he wished she wouldn't continue. But he remained silent, listening to her intently. Rachel held his hand, wanting to convey everything she felt clearly and honestly. "But the truth is, as special as you are to me, I realized my heart is somewhere else." Rachel felt the weight of the words as she said them, but she knew Liam deserved that sincerity, even if it was painful. "I tried to understand what I felt and focus on this feeling that we have, But deep down, I feel like there is something between me and Alexander that I can't ignore. It's something that I still don't know exactly what it means, but I need to find out." Liam took a deep breath, looking away for a moment. She noticed his eyes moistening, even though he maintained control. After a brief silence, he looked at her again, with a sad but genuine smile. "Rachel, I always knew something drew you to him, something I may never understand. And as much as it hurts now, I want you to know that I always wanted you to be happy. I will respect your decision, even if it means giving up everything I imagined for us." His voice was low and choked, and Rachel felt her heart sink. Seeing him hurt was a pain I didn't expect to feel so intensely. "You're amazing, Liam. Thank you for everything, for helping me grow, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself," she said, her voice breaking. They hugged, a long hug full of meanings, of goodbyes and of memories that would always remain. She felt the tears flow, but she knew she needed to be honest with him, and he, in turn, let her go with the dignity and generosity he had always shown. When they walked away, Liam smiled sadly, wiping away a tear that had fallen. "If you need a friend, I'll be here. And if one day that all changes, you know where to find me." Rachel nodded, feeling the weight of goodbye and at the same time, the lightness of finally being honest with him and with herself. She knew that that love for Liam would always be special, but that what was between them was, in fact, something that she would need to let go of in order to move forward. Later that same day, Rachel mustered up the courage to finally confront Alexander. He was in the office, immersed in documents, but when he saw Rachel enter, he dropped what he was doing, feeling somehow that the conversation they had been putting off for so long was finally about to happen. "Alexander, can we talk?" Rachel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded and indicated the chair in front, but she remained standing, determined to be as direct as possible. "I spent a lot of time trying to understand my feelings," she began, looking at him with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I tried to move away, to focus on myself, but I realized that even when I was alone, you never left my thoughts. What I feel for you is intense, and despite all the fear, the uncertainty, I want to be with you." Alexander remained silent, but his gaze conveyed a depth that moved her. He slowly stood up, and the distance between them seemed to symbolically decrease. The seriousness in his gaze was now replaced by something softer, more intimate. Without looking away, he approached, hesitant but determined. "Rachel," he said, his voice deep but full of sincerity, "I know I've never been an easy person to understand. I lived in a bubble of control and isolation for so long that I thought I'd never be able to open up to anyone. But with you, I feel like I'm capable of being more, of allowing myself something that I gave up a long time ago." He moved closer, gently cupping her face, as if that moment was too precious to be rushed. Rachel felt her heart race, but this time, there was no doubt, just a feeling of certainty that she had never experienced before. "I want to be with you," Alexander continued, his tone low and firm. "I know it won't be easy. My past is something I still carry, but with you, I feel like maybe there's a chance I can overcome it." Rachel smiled, excited, and let him pull her close, joining their lips in a kiss that sealed all the uncertainties and hesitations of the last few months. It was a kiss that carried the weight of a decision, of a love that had been built slowly, with all the difficulties and challenges. Being in Alexander's arms at that moment made all the whirlwind of feelings finally find a resolution. The days that followed were of adaptation and new discoveries. Rachel and Alexander began to explore what it meant to be together, and although they were both intense and complex, they felt lighter in each shared moment. Alexander struggled to be more open and present, and Rachel, in turn, brought him a peace he had never felt before. As for Liam, he stepped away for a while, giving himself the space he needed to heal the wounds. Rachel knew she had hurt him, and even though the guilt still weighed heavily at times, she knew she had done what she needed to. Honesty was something she owed to him and to herself, and in time, she wished he would find someone who could love him as deeply as he deserved. The relationship with Alexander still had its challenges, but their presence in each other's lives seemed to give meaning to each difficulty. Rachel felt that, for the first time, she was where she truly belonged, next to someone who understood her and who, above all, made her feel alive. One night when the office was almost empty and silence filled the hallways, Alexander finally allowed himself to pick up Rachel. He knew it was time to open his heart, something he had been putting off not only out of fear, but also because of the difficulty in accepting that he was finally in love with someone. For him, love had always been a word filled with uncertainty and vulnerability that he avoided. But with Rachel, that view had changed, and he knew he needed to expose that feeling, whatever the consequence. Rachel was in the studio, finishing some notes on one of the scripts she was preparing. When she saw him standing at the door, she looked up, immediately noticing the seriousness in his expression. He seemed different, as if he was carrying something that had been stored away for a long time, and she felt her heart quicken as she realized the weight of that moment. Alexander entered, closed the door behind him, and approached her with careful steps, his hands in his pockets as if preparing for a leap of faith. Rachel stood up slowly, following his every movement, and knew somehow that that night would be remarkable. "Rachel," he began, his voice lower and more vulnerable than she had ever heard it before. I've been thinking a lot about us, about what you represent in my life, about everything I've felt since you got here." She held her breath, feeling intense anticipation and excitement as he continued, his gaze fixed on hers. "I've always been someone who built high, thick walls. Everything I've done up until now has been to protect myself, to never feel vulnerable again," she confessed, her eyes revealing a mix of fragility and intensity that made her even more emotional. "But you came into my life and, without making any effort, you broke down all those walls. And for the first time in many years, I feel like I can, maybe, allow myself to be happy with someone." Rachel felt his words resonate in every corner of her heart, and a wave of emotion washed over her. Alexander was finally confessing that he loved her, that he wanted to be by her side. He looked at her as if she were the only person in the world capable of understanding who he really was. Every word carried a raw sincerity, a need to be accepted and understood, and she felt the depth of that love, the weight of years of protection and loneliness that he, in that moment, chose to abandon for her. "Alexander," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I can't explain how much this means to me. I was lost too, torn, but deep down, I always felt like it was you, that you're the one I want to be with. Despite everything we face, despite all the fear." He reached out his hand, hesitantly, and Rachel held it, feeling the strength and delicacy of that contact. It was a simple gesture, but full of a truth that, until then, both were reluctant to accept. Alexander pulled her closer, her eyes fixed on his, and she realized that there was something there that went far beyond passion. It was a meeting of souls, of someone who had finally decided to trust and surrender. "Rachel, I don't know if I can be the man you deserve," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I still have a lot of wounds, but I want to try. I really want to be happy with you, if you're willing to take the risk." She smiled, touching his face gently, feeling his breathing ragged at the moment, and shook her head. "Alexander, I don't expect perfection. I just want you, exactly as you are, and I'm here, by your side, ready to face whatever comes." For a moment, silence settled between them, filled with all the feelings that no longer needed words. Alexander, still hesitant, but filled with a courage that she knew came from the love he felt, approached her and kissed her. The touch was delicate, but filled with an intensity that expressed everything they had repressed until that moment. It was a kiss that sealed a promise, a beginning, something that Rachel knew was more than a simple romance. She gave herself into the kiss, responding with all the emotion she had saved throughout those months, feeling her heart beating faster and the world around her disappearing. There, in that moment, all that mattered was him, and she knew that they were finally where they truly belonged. The kiss between Rachel and Alexander, which started softly, soon turned into something deep, almost urgent, as if they were both finally releasing all the feelings they had held back for so long. He held her firmly, but with a care that revealed how much that moment meant to him. And Rachel, feeling the intensity of his touch, reciprocated with equal dedication, allowing herself to feel everything she had previously tried to repress. When finally they separated, still holding hands and with their eyes fixed on each other. A slight smile appeared on Alexander's face, something rare and genuine. Rachel noticed that, in that moment, he was lighter, almost unrecognizable, as if that first confession of love had, in fact, broken down the barriers he had kept around himself for years. He pulled her closer, still silent, and she laid her head on his chest, listening to the sound of his heart, which was beating as fast as hers. "Rachel," he murmured, breaking the silence with a voice that sounded almost reverent. "I don't know for sure what the future holds for us, but I need you to know. You brought something into my life that I thought I had lost forever." He took a deep breath, as if he needed to gather the courage to continue. "Love has always been a weakness for me, something I avoided at all costs. But with you, it doesn't seem like a weakness. On the contrary." Rachel looked up at him, a soft gleam of understanding in her eyes. "Alexander, I don't know what it's going to be like either, but I think part of loving is exactly that. It's accepting what we don't know, trusting what we feel, even if it scares us." He nodded, absorbing her words as if they were a truth he had always known, but needed to hear from someone else to believe. Rachel saw him smile slightly and let out a sigh, as if he was relieved, as if that meeting had finally opened a new path. "There's so much I need to share with you," Alexander said, taking one of her hands in his thumb stroking her skin gently. "Things from the past that I always kept locked away. My life has many secrets, but I want you to know every part of it, no matter how difficult it is." Rachel felt the sincerity in his words and squeezed his hand in response. "I'm here, Alexander, for everything, for anything you need to share. You can trust me." He watched her for a moment, his eyes almost glowing with a rare vulnerability. "You're the first person I really want to trust, Rachel, and I don't intend to waste that." They sat on the office sofa, side by side, and Alexander began to talk about his past, sharing memories of his father, the pressure he felt when taking over the company at such a young age, the fear of failure and the scars he carried for account of that. Rachel listened silently, with complete attention, and from time to time, she squeezed his hand to remind him that she was there, that he didn't need to be afraid to show his more human side. Alexander continued, now talking about his personal losses, the pain he had felt when losing his father, the solitude he had chosen as a refuge to not suffer anymore. Rachel saw that every word he said was like a weight less, a release he had never allowed himself before. They were creating a true intimacy, something that went beyond the physical, a soul-to-soul connection, as if every piece of their past was finally finding its place, making room for them to build something new. At the end of the story, Alexander looked at her, and Rachel noticed that his eyes were teary, although he was trying to hold back his emotions. "You changed everything for me, Rachel. It's like I'm waking up after years in a strange dream, where happiness was just a distant memory." Rachel smiled and, without saying anything, hugged him, feeling the depth of love they now shared, something she never imagined experiencing. With Alexander, love was not just a light and safe feeling, but something that demanded courage, dedication, and absolute trust from her. She knew it wouldn't be an easy relationship, but at that moment, she was willing to face anything with him. They stood there, silent, comfortable in each other's presence, and Rachel felt like she was finally where she was supposed to be. The weight of uncertainty, Rochelle's and indecision seemed to have disappeared, and next to Alexander, she experienced a type of happiness that transcended words, a sense of belonging that gave her the certainty that, together, they could overcome any problem, challenge. The days that followed were of adaptation. Rachel and Alexander tried to find a balance between their relationship and work, knowing that, for their colleagues, that sudden proximity could generate doubts and questions. But amid the professionalism of the office, there were small moments that kept their romance alive and intimate. Looks exchanged from afar, a discreet touch of the hand as they pass each other in the corridors, or the brief meeting of their eyes during a meeting. They were simple gestures, but full of meaning, which strengthened the bond between the two. One night after work, Alexander surprised her with a private dinner in his apartment, where they talked about life, the expectations and the dreams that they were finally beginning to share. Sitting at the table, he held her hand and looked at her with a smile that showed serenity. "You know," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. "You make me want things I thought I'd never need. And perhaps the most surprising thing is that now I can't imagine my life without it." Rachel felt her heart warm. Seeing Alexander talk openly about the future, about his desire to build something with her, was something that made her feel not only loved, but also part of a path they were tracing together. One that they had both chosen, even in the face of all odds, the uncertainties. That night, as she watched Alexander in the soft light of the apartment, Rachel realized that every step, every choice, and every uncertainty she had faced had led her to this moment. There, next to a man who finally took off his masks and protections to be authentic with her, she felt that she had found more than just love. He had found a home, and I knew, deeply, that together they could face anything. The following months were transformative for Rachel. She dedicated herself to her work with a renewed intensity, driven by Alexander's unconditional support and determination to build a solid career at Altvoice. Little by little, he gained the trust of his superiors, who noticed his commitment talent. With her growth came the promotion she had long desired. Rachel became one of the company's main voices, responsible for narrating the most important projects. With each recording, with each new challenge, she felt like she was finally taking the place she deserved. Alexander, in turn, had become her greatest ally, encouraging her and celebrating each of her victories. He watched admiringly, the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about new projects or the impact of her stories on the public. Together, they found a rhythm that combined love and professionalism, respecting each other's ambitions and knowing when to give space. They balanced work and their relationship with the silent complicity of those who knew exactly what the other needed. And this new phase consolidated the love they fought so hard to build. On the day Rachel received the formal announcement of her promotion, Alexander organized a surprise for her. At the end of the day, he took her to a private restaurant with a panoramic view of the city, where, under the soft light of candles, they celebrated her new achievement. He looked at her with a pride he couldn't disguise, and Rachel, sitting next to him, felt that every effort had been worth it. "Rachel, today you proved that your talent goes far beyond what anyone imagined," he said, holding her hand across the table. "I always knew you had something special, but seeing you grow into the professional you are now is inspiring." Rachel smiled, an excited gleam in her eyes. "Alexander, none of this would have been possible without you. Your trust, your support, all of this gave me strength when I needed it most. You always believed in me, and I think that was the difference." He shook her hand with a sincere and serene look. "Maybe I just helped you see what you couldn't see yourself. But it's all your credit, Rachel. Your courage, your determination. You made it all happen." After dinner, Alexander took her to a hill outside the city, where the lights of New York shone in the distance like a constellation. They stood there, in silence, holding each other and watching the view, with the feeling that every moment spent together was precious. Amidst the peace of that scene, Alexander looked at Rachel, his face serious, but with a serenity that made her curious. "Rachel, I already told you that I never imagined I'd find someone like you. You brought something to my life that I didn't even know I needed," he began, his voice deep but soft. "And now, I want you to know that I'm ready for it to be more than that." She watched him intently, her heart beating faster, as he took her hand and intertwined their fingers in a gesture that seemed both firm and delicate. "I want you to know that everything in me, every part of who I am, is committed to you," he said, with a seriousness that she recognized as a promise. "I want us to be a team, at work and in life. I want to build everything by your side." Rachel felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and with teary eyes, she smiled, unable to hide the happiness that caused her. "Alexander, I don't know what to say. I also want to be by your side, in every moment. You are my strength, my balance, my peace." They exchanged a deep kiss, which sealed a union that they both knew was now forever. In that moment, under the starry sky and with the city lights in the background, Rachel felt that, finally, all the pieces of her life were where they belonged. In the months that followed, Rachel and Alexander adapted to the natural rhythm of life together. She continued to narrate Altvoice's main projects, gaining recognition and prestige in the sector, while he always by her side, managed the company with the same strong and determined vision, but now with a lighter and more open touch, something she knew that his love had given him. Alexander learned to share important moments with Rachel, to allow himself to celebrate and relax without the constant tension he had before. She, in turn, felt safer than ever because she knew he was there, that he supported her and loved her unconditionally. They became partners in life and work, building a solid and fulfilling relationship. On one of the most memorable days of her career, Rachel received an award for her contribution to audiobook storytelling, recognized for her ability to move and engage audiences with her voice. At the awards event, Alexander was present by her side, and when she went on stage to receive the award, she saw his proud and emotional look in the audience. He knew how hard she had fought to get there, and seeing her be recognized was one of the greatest satisfactions he could have. At the end of the event, when they were together in the car, Alexander held her hand, and she saw that he was visibly moved. He turned to her with a sincere smile. "I always knew you were destined for great things, Rachel. Seeing you be recognized for what you do with so much passion, it's an honor to be by your side." Rachel, touched by his words, held his hand tightly. "And I only did it because you were with me, because you showed me that, to grow, I needed to believe in myself." They kissed, and in that moment, Rachel felt that, with Alexander, she was finally complete.